Many thanks, and that concludes portfolio questions. And the next item of business is a statement by John Swinney on the 2012-13 provisional outturn. The Cabinet Secretary will take questions at the end of his statement, and there should therefore be no interventions or interruptions. Mr Swinney, when you are ready, you have 10 minutes to make your statement, please.
Presiding Officer, I am grateful for the opportunity to inform Parliament of the Provisional Scottish Government financial outturn for 2012-13. The Government believes it is essential that we maximise the value of every public pound as we take forward programmes to support economic recovery and deliver high-quality, efficient public services. As a demonstration of this Government's sound financial management, I can report to Parliament that the provisional outturn for 2012-13 is expenditure of £27,908 million against a fiscal departmental expenditure limit budget of £28,087 million, an underspend of £179 million, representing some 0.6% of our fiscal DEL budget. Fiscal DEL is now the key control aggregate used by Her Majesty's Treasury and is made up of the cash resource and capital budgets. The underspend for the resource and capital budgets was £150 million and £29 million respectively. Turning to the other elements of our budget, there is a forecast underspend on non-cash DEL of around £111 million on a budget of £892 million. This is the ring-fenced element within the budget intended to cover depreciation, some impairments and other technical accounting items. £65 million of this underspend relates to a less than anticipated write-down of the current book valuation of the income contingent repayment student loan book. A further £22 million is due to lower than anticipated depreciation on the road network. An underspend on the non-cash budget cannot be used to buy goods and services. Accordingly, this is not a loss in spending power for the Scottish Government. The 2012-13 Public Expenditure Statistical Analysis is due to be published in July by Her Majesty's Treasury, which will place on record the provisional outturn for Scotland against total resource DEL. This includes cash and non-cash, resource cash DEL and capital DEL. This will represent underspends of £261 million, £150 million and £29 million respectively. Parliament will wish to note that the devolved administration's budget exchange mechanism agreed with the Treasury in July 2011 will be utilised for the second year. Since devolution, the Scottish Government had the facility to carry forward any unspent budget to future years. This process was known as end-year flexibility. End-year flexibility was abolished unilaterally as part of the 2010 UK spending review. The budget exchange mechanism for the devolved administrations will be in operation over the current spending review period. This allows the Scottish Government limited flexibility to carry forward from one financial year to the next, up to 0.6% of its resource DEL budget and 1.5% of its capital DEL budget. This equates to a cap this year of £200 million in total. In 2011-12, we carried forward £179 million fiscal DEL in the budget exchange mechanism for use in 2012-13. This year, we will be carrying forward the same amount of £179 million to be utilised in 2013-14. In our budget for 2013-14, we had factored into our plans a carry forward from 2012-13 of £158 million, made up of £150 million resource DEL and £8 million capital DEL. We have delivered this plan. Accordingly, I am pleased to inform Parliament today that the balance of the fiscal DEL underspend, £21 million in capital DEL, will be carried forward in full to augment existing spending plans in 2013-14. The sums to be deployed will be confirmed in the autumn budget revision when the audit of the financial year is complete. However, I have some important points that I wish to confirm to Parliament today. A modest capital DEL underspend emerged in the housing and regeneration programme due to timing differences between demand and the availability of funding in capital budgets. There is a £5.3 million underspend on the Jessica Urban Regeneration Programme, which is a demand-led budget. We have a commitment to provide £26 million of capital DEL over the lifetime of the fund, supported by £24 million of European funding, and we will honour this commitment by carrying the £5.3 million sum forward and deploying in 2013-14. Secondly, there is a £7.7 million underspend on the shared equity scheme. This is a demand-led scheme, and the underspend represents timing differences between the setting of budgets and the eventual drawdown by scheme participants. I can confirm that the £7.7 million underspend will be deployed in 2013-14 to support our overall investment in the housing programme. In addition, I intend to earmark a further £5.9 million to give a total of £18.9 million to augment the Government's Housing and Regeneration programme in 2013-14. Capital investment continues to be a central element of our approach to supporting economic recovery, with a focus on priority area to support output and jobs. I have used budget flexibility to supplement our original Spending Review 2010 capital budget of £2.475 billion to help stimulate infrastructure investment. In June 2012, I announced a package of shovel-ready projects totalling £105 million to support new investment and accelerate projects from future years to boost the economy. 6 months later, in December 2012, I announced a £205 million capital investment package of construction and maintenance projects. In addition, in 2012-13, we expanded the infrastructure investment programme by switching £227.6 million from resource budgets to capital budgets. I can confirm that I will write to the Finance Committee setting out the full details of the 2012-13 resource to capital switches by portfolio and spending programme once details are finalised shortly. Our budget choices for 2012-13 have enabled the Scottish Government to undertake a range of measures to tackle unemployment, with a particular focus on youth unemployment. These have included 25,000 modern apprenticeship opportunities in each year of the current Parliament, an additional £30 million allocated for youth employability over the 3 years to 2014-15, £25 million of European funding refocused to support youth employment and business growth for SMEs, and maintained the education maintenance allowance, which has now been abolished in England. We are enhancing economic confidence by encouraging private sector investment and providing security to Scottish households through our actions, which have included supporting growth and exporting companies to access loans through the £113 million Scottish Loan Fund, providing businesses with the most generous package of rates relief available anywhere in the UK, worth over £500 million a year over the period 2010 to 2015. Our actions against these priorities are helping to support the Scottish economy during the toughest economic conditions in over a generation. A clear picture is emerging of the economic journey that Scotland has made since my last provisional outturn statement. This time last year, output in Scotland was contracting, but now the picture is more encouraging. Scotland's output picked up towards the end of 2012, and we saw a return to positive growth in the final 2 quarters of last year. In the latest quarter, quarter 4 2012, Scotland's output grew by 0.5%. Scotland has also seen an improvement in its labour market. Employment levels have been rising and unemployment levels falling. In the year up to February to April 2013, there were 43,000 more people employed in Scotland and 25,000 fewer people unemployed. Over the same period, 25,000 fewer of our young people were unemployed. And Scotland is now outperforming the UK in all 3 main labour market indicator rates of employment, unemployment and economic inactivity. Recent business survey data for Scotland indicates a positive outlook for 2013, with the Bank of Scotland PMI for May showing private sector activity expanding for the 8th consecutive month at a rate of 54.4, which is significantly faster than the rate of expansion, 50.8, for the same month last year. Presiding Officer, I would like very briefly to take this opportunity to confirm to Parliament how I plan to address the challenges we face with regard to our 2013-14 budget, the timetable for the draft budget 2014-15 and the forthcoming outcome of the UK's 2015-16 spending round. Once again, on the basis of a UK budget announcement, we are dealing with cuts to our budget. The UK budget in March confirmed reductions in our fiscal resource DEL budget for both financial years 2013-14 and 2014-15 of £54.8 million and £48.7 million respectively. As previously notified to Parliament, we will seek to minimise the impact of the £54.8 million reduction in our 2013-14 fiscal resource DEL budget on frontline services and public sector employment in Scotland through a number of measures, and these will be taken forward through the autumn budget revision process. I can confirm to Parliament that the draft budget for 2014-15 will be presented in line with written agreements in September. The outcome of the UK spending round will be announced on the 26th of June. We have continued to press the Chancellor and the Chief Secretary to the Treasury to invest in jobs and growth and to address the clear criticism of their budget approach by both the OECD and the IMF. It appears from the reports around those UK departments who have agreed settlements with the UK Government that we should be braced once again for cuts to the Scottish budget. Scotland does not support this approach, and with the tools of independence and the wealth of Scotland's resources, we would not be pursuing this approach. This government wants Scotland to reach its full potential. In order to get there, we need the tools to build that better, more prosperous and fairer country that everyone wants to see. Presiding Officer, I commend these outturn figures to the Chamber. They demonstrate once again the firm grip that this government has on Scotland's public finances and the competent financial management of the resources at our disposal.
Many thanks. And the Cabinet Secretary will now take questions on the issues raised in his statement, and I intend to allow around 20 minutes for questions, after which we will move to the next item of business. And it will be helpful if members who wish to ask a question were to press the request to speak buttons now. And we now move to the questions. Question 1, Ken McIntosh.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and can I thank the Finance Secretary for advance notice of his statement, and also recognise that we share common ground in opposing the approach to the public finances of the Tory government. Having said that, we're here to scrutinise the decisions taken by the Scottish Government, and I would note, for example, there are a number of omissions from the statement today, including any mention of the £333 million underspend in his planned NPD programme for 2012-2013. I have to say I'm also disappointed to hear a reference to the Scottish Government's notorious shovel-ready programme, but no update on exactly how many shovels are now actually in the ground. Turning to the announcements the Minister has made, the Cabinet Secretary points out that he has already committed £158 million of his £179 million underspend. Of the remaining £21 million in capital at his disposal, the majority seems to come from an underspent housing budget and is being recommitted to housing, along with an additional £5.9 million, which is to be welcomed. But given that he revisited his housing budget cuts 4 times in the last financial year, he tried again in the budget this year, and here he is having a 6th attempt at putting right his original wrong, does he not think it would have been wiser for him to have listened to those in the construction and housing industries in the first place and implemented Labour's budget for housing? Can I ask him specifically if he is content that the reality of his budget outturn for this year is in fact the lowest number of housing completions since the Great Depression? Can I further ask the Cabinet Secretary why there is nothing in his statement today about the impact of his budget on further education? In particular, can I ask him to explain the relationship between his cuts to Scotland's colleges and the 700 jobs that have been lost in further education in the last year alone?
Thank you. Cabinet Secretary John Swinney.
Can I welcome Mr McIntosh's acknowledgement that we have common ground on many of these issues, although it wasn't immediately obvious from the majority of his contribution today. Can I confirm to Mr McIntosh that the Government's NPD programme will be spent in full? As he well knows, it is a programme that spans over a 5 to 6 year period. There are a number of projects that are now in procurement. Some projects have reached financial close, some projects are starting on site, so the programme of NPD interventions is taking its course, and of course that's only possible because of the decisions we took in the light of the reductions in public expenditure that were applied by the United Kingdom Government in 2010. On the question of shovel-ready projects, there is an extensive list of projects that are underway in implementing the expenditure announcements that I've made during the financial year. I'd point out to Mr McIntosh that the budget includes additional expenditure that I've allocated into the budget at the time of the autumn budget revision and the spring budget revision. The budget is £289 million larger as a consequence of the autumn budget and spring budget revisions, and we have delivered an underspend in addition to our planned carry forward of only £21 million. So that should be reassurance enough to Mr McIntosh that the shovel-ready projects are being applied and implemented on the ground. In relation to his point on housing, I can only spend the resources that I have available to me. Again, Mr McIntosh should know that. That is the financial restrictions within which I have to operate as the Finance Minister in a devolved Scotland. And what I've done is, on every available opportunity I've had to expand resources for housing, I've taken that opportunity to do so. In relation to the college sector, yes, there have been reductions in the college budget, but the reason why I cited the economic indicators in my statement, such as the fact that over the last 12 months we have 25,000 fewer of our young people unemployed, that we have 43,000 more of our people employed, 25,000 fewer individuals unemployed in Scotland, I think is an indication that the government's measures, in addition to modern apprenticeships and places at colleges, that the government's measures are boosting the skills element of our economy, and I think that should be welcomed across the chamber.
Gavin Brown.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I also begin by thanking the Cabinet Secretary for advance notice of his statement. A couple of specifics I would like him to answer. One of them is this. He talked about a £21 million capital underspend. He explained how 5.3 million of it came about and how 7.7 million of it came about. Can he tell the Chamber why the rest of the capital underspend happened? Secondly, can he tell us what percentage of the total shared equity scheme money is represented by the £7.7 million underspend? And can he update us specifically on what progress has been made on the ground for the shovel-ready projects that were announced in December of last year, the £205 million worth of projects? And finally, Deputy Presiding Officer, he said near the end of his speech that he wanted the tools of independence. Can he explain to the Chamber why even his backbenchers failed to clap at that mention? Thank you.
Cabinet Secretary.
On Mr Brown's first point on capital underspends, we're talking about in the scale of a £2.4 billion capital budget, very small underspends arising from the crystallisation of payments at the close of the financial year, which our best efforts and predictions would identify as to which sums were likely to crystallise on which side of the financial year, which accounts for many of the small items at the margins of the capital underspend. I can't give him a figure on the percentage that the shared equity element represents, but I'll check that for him. There will, of course, be an element of that programme is demand-led, so I think we have to acknowledge that it's a bit like the point that Mr McIntosh raised about the number of housing completions. If the private market is not stimulated sufficiently to construct houses, it's kind of difficult for the government to be held to account, or this government to be held to account for all of that, and that obviously is a bearing on some of the issues in shared equity. On the question of the tools of independence, I'm very confident that my backbenchers are enthusiastic supporters of having the range of financial levers that would enable this government not to have had to face the reductions in capital expenditure that would be set out. And I certainly am very confident that my backbenchers today could generate a great deal more noise than Mr Brown's single, solitary backbencher who's maybe not even paying much attention to what's going on in the chamber today.
Many thanks. Kenneth Gibson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And as an enthusiastic supporter of independence, I welcome the Cabinet Secretary's statement. Given that Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Danny Alexander, again cancelled his scheduled appearance at the Finance Committee last month, can I ask the Cabinet Secretary what explanation the UK Government has provided for their decision to remove £103.5 million of resources from the Scottish budget and replace it with loans less than 2 weeks before the beginning of the current financial year? And now this has impacted on the Scottish budget and the Scottish Government's financial flexibility, notwithstanding what might be announced by the Chancellor next week.
Cabinet Secretary.
The issue of the reductions in the budget have been explained to the Scottish Government by the UK Government as being part of their long-term deficit reduction programme, and they have been set out as a device to try to create further capital investment resources that can be deployed in future years. We may get some clue about that when it comes to the statement that the Chancellor will make to the House of Commons next Wednesday in the 2015-16 budget round. As for the replacement of these, the provision of loans, the Government has set out to Parliament some weeks ago the steps the Government was taking to allocate these loan facilities to housing initiatives and interventions. I would make the obvious point to Parliament that these schemes are all, again, demand-led. They do not, they cannot be driven by government spending power in the fashion that traditional capital expenditure can be driven. So we have to be very careful in how we consider and assess the impact of the financial transactions that the UK Government has now put in place.
Thank you. Willie Rennie.
I thank the Finance Secretary in advance copy of his statement. Again today, he lectured us about the need to spend more, but for the second year running, he's taken a 9-figure sum out of his budget and put it into the next year. To me, that's delayed, not accelerated spending. On capital, the Futures Trust underspent by £300 million. They demanded the fossil fuel level for energy, but then failed to spend it. If anyone else did this, would be accused of sucking money out of the economy. So can the Finance Secretary tell us today what he's planning to spend the underspent capital on in terms of shovel-ready projects? Is he going to detail that today?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, if Mr Rennie had been paying attention to the 3-year budget process, he would have acknowledged that when I set out the 3-year budget to Parliament in the autumn of 2011, I made clear, because of the erratic financial settlement we had been given by the UK Government, it was essential for us to take a much more orderly approach to public expenditure over the 3-year period. So I advertised to Parliament the fact that there would be carry-over expenditure to ensure the sustainability of the public services and the public finances. Now, if I hadn't done that, Mr Rennie would have been at the front of the queue complaining about the fact that we were taking an erratic approach to public service support. That's exactly what he would have been complaining about. Now, what I have done with the available capital consequentials that I have available to me is I have spent them in the appropriate financial years to deliver the maximum economic impact. And I just gently point out to Mr Rennie that if we had listened to all of the strictures of his government, we would have had no NPD programme, we would not have been taking forward these projects that are having the impact on capital expenditure and capital projects within the country. And that's the type of stewardship of the public finances that's essential to deliver the maximum impact for the public of Scotland.
Many thanks. I just say briefer questions and answers would now be appreciated. Jamie Hepburn to be followed by Rhoda Grant.
Thank you, President Ross. The Cabinet Secretary referred to the criticism of the OECD and the IMF of the UK Government's economic strategy and the fact that the Scottish Government is pressing for them to adopt a different strategy rather than the austerity agenda, which is suppressing growth and recovery. In terms of the contact the Government has had, can the Cabinet Secretary set out what the response has been? Can we expect the UK Government to change their strategy, or will it be more of the austerity agenda?
We have seen the fact that the UK Government, to be fair to them, have reduced the scale of the cut in our capital budget from 33% to 26%. Now, it's still far too significant. It's been far too damaging to the health of the Scottish economy. But I think there is a signal in that the UK Government recognises that their original budget propositions were wrong, that they inflicted significant economic damage. And if we need to assess that significant economic damage, we find the answer in the additional amount of borrowing the UK Government has had to make to take account of low growth in the economy, which they could have avoided if they had invested more heavily in capital expenditure in 2010, when this Government told them it was the right thing to do. And that, of course, that message that we set out in 2010 has now been reinforced by both the IMF and the OECD, and I hope the UK Government has listened to those messages.
Thank you. Rhoda Grant.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Cabinet Secretary talks about high-quality, efficient public services in a statement. However, he doesn't mention in the statement that he has now spent over £800 million putting public servants out of work. Can I ask if he considers this efficient use of public money, or could it have been better spent building our economy and putting people to work?
Thank you. Cabinet Secretary.
That question just raises with me the question in my own mind. How would we have paid for these people if we had kept them on the public purse? how would we have paid for them? If we don't have the money to pay for public servants because of reductions in public expenditure, how do we pay for them? We can't take people on and then not give them a paycheck at the end of the month. If the Labour Party doesn't even understand that, then the Labour Party's economic credibility is in an even worse state of affairs than I ever thought it was in.
Many thanks. Stuart Stevenson.
Is the Cabinet Secretary aware that in 2010 it was said the UK Government continues to take Scotland for granted? Now, that was in relation to employment, and of course it was said by the gentleman who is now the First Secretary to the Treasury. Does he think that it's perhaps time for that gentleman to respond to what he said in 2010 and change his capital spending plans, both in Scotland but especially in the UK, where unemployment, by contrast to Scotland, is rising?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I think the comparative position on employment patterns north and south of the border is instructive. I think it illustrates that, and it's why I marshalled the information today to demonstrate that the different economic strategy taken by this government has delivered a different outcome for Scotland. And I think the UK government, back to the point I answered in relation to Mr Hepburn's question, the UK government needs to understand that, without action to remedy the reductions in capital expenditure, the ability to recover from the economic difficulties that we face will be prolonged for many people within our society.
Thanks. Christian Allard.
As a backbencher was listening to the statement of the Cabinet Secretary, I know that this is the second year that the new budget exchange mechanism has been used. Can I ask the Cabinet Secretary for his assessment of the new mechanism, whether he feels it delivers for Scotland and what he would like to see improved?
Cabinet Secretary.
I think actually the budget exchange mechanism that the devolved administrations were able to negotiate, it's a combined approach with my colleagues in Wales and Northern Ireland, and by agreement with the Treasury, has actually proved to be a very useful mechanism for ensuring that we have an orderly approach to budgeting between different years of erratic planning by the UK government. The budget exchange mechanism is set at what I consider to be reasonable levels. I don't think it's appropriate for there to be vast underspends in any given financial year. I think underspends should be tightly controlled. When I came to office, my predecessors had been unable to spend £1.6 billion worth of public expenditure. I don't think that's a desirable situation to be in. Expenditure should be tightly managed, and we've demonstrated that we can do that, and that the budget exchange mechanism is set at a reasonable level to ensure tight financial discipline, but also to ensure that resources, where they need to be carried forward in a reasonable fashion, can be done so.
Thank you, Patrick Harvey.
Thank you, and I'm grateful to the Cabinet Secretary for the advance copy of the statement, which he ended by looking to the future. If we are facing even deeper cuts, both to the government's budget and to household budgets through the UK government's approach to the welfare system, isn't it going to be increasingly clear that we can only protect public services within balanced budgets by recognising that taxation must play a role and empowering local government to make their own decisions about local taxation based on local democratic mandates?
Your Cabinet Secretary, briefly, if you can, please.
I think Mr Harvey referred to the position of households, and I agree with him. I think households have been under real pressure since, before this government came to office, with the rise in the council tax. They've been under real pressure since 2007-8 about rising charges from power companies, from other tax changes by the UK government. But what members of the public in Scotland have been able to rely upon is a firm commitment given by this government that the council tax would be frozen. We've delivered on that commitment. People told me before 2007, A, it would never be delivered, B, it was illegal. We have delivered it since 2007, and we have every intention of continuing to do so.
Many thanks. And I apologise to members I've been unable to call as we now move on to the next item of business, which is a debate on motion number 6987 in the name of Kenny MacAskill on stage 1 of the Victims and Witnesses Scotland Bill. and invite members who wish to speak in the debate to press the request to speak buttons and ensure that their cards are correctly inserted, please. And I will now call on Cabinet Secretary Kenny McCaskill to speak to and move your motion. Cabinet Secretary, you have 13 minutes when you're ready, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I'm grateful for the opportunity to open the Stage 1 debate in the Victims and Witnesses Scotland Bill. And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank both the Justice Committee and the Health and Sport Committee for their efforts in scrutinising the justice and health elements of the bill at Stage 1 and for the preparation of their comprehensive Stage 1 reports. I would also like to record my thanks to the groups and individuals who provided evidence to the committees during Stage 1, as well as those who have engaged directly with us during the development of the bill and the parliamentary process to date. The Victims and Witnesses Bill has a clear aim: to put the needs of victims and witnesses at the centre of the criminal justice system. The bill includes proposals to ensure that justice agencies set out clear standards of service for victims and witnesses, gives victims and witnesses a right to access information about their case, improve the identification of vulnerable witnesses and the support available to them. Also, introduce a victim surcharge and restitution orders to make offenders contribute to the cost of providing vital support to the victims of crime, and make various other improvements to the justice system. The bill also contains proposals to establish a national confidential forum, which will give adults who were placed in care as children the opportunity to recount their experiences in a confidential and non-judgmental setting to an independent panel. This sits separately from the justice-related proposals, and I'll turn to that part of the bill in due course. The proposals in the bill have not been developed in isolation. In addition to the formal consultation exercise, we have engaged extensively with victim support groups and individual victims in developing the bill. Only this morning, I was in Hamilton to visit Victim Support Scotland's National Support Centre and heard from volunteers and indeed victims about their experiences of interacting with the justice system and what improvements would have made that process a little easier for them. It is important to note that the bill cannot be seen in isolation, as it is an integral part of our wider Making Justice Work programme. This programme, the Making Justice Work programme, brings together a wide range of reforms to the structure and processes of the courts, access to justice and tribunals and administrative justice, and it has been developed and is being developed with partners across the justice system, including the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service, the Scottish Court Service, the Scottish Legal Aid Board and Police Scotland. The programme represents the most significant set of reforms to our courts for more than a century. And a central objective of this programme is to improve the experience of victims and witnesses, and this bill is a key component of that. So can I say I warmly welcome both the Justice and Health and Sport Committee support for the general principles of the bill and their recommendation to the Parliament that they be approved. We recognise that it is a matter shared across the political divide, that witnesses and victims have to be cared for and their care improved. Looking first at the Justice Committee's report, it is clear that although generally supportive, there have been some concerns raised in certain areas and some requests for further clarification. I'll address a few of these issues briefly now, and will be interested to hear members' views during the debate. The use of the word victim in the bill has raised some concerns that the presumption of innocence of the accused may be compromised, and it was pointed out that the term complainer is used in other legislation. The report recommended that victim be defined in the bill. I've made clear from the start that ensuring the rights of the accused are not compromised is absolutely critical, and I welcome the committee's scrutiny of the bill from that important perspective. However, I do not believe that the bill poses any risks to the presumption of innocence. While there is no overarching definition of victim, the bill provides clarity where necessary in the context of individual sections. For example, making clear that the individuals referred may be victims or alleged victims. And I look forward to members' comments today, and though I am not persuaded that an overarching definition is required, I am, of course, happy to consider whether any further clarity may be necessary, and if members do have those views, then I'm happy to meet and discuss with them. Another area raised by the committee is the proposed right to object to special measures for vulnerable witnesses. The intention behind these provisions was not to complicate proceedings or to undermine the support available to vulnerable witnesses, but rather to ensure compatibility with ECHR as we require to, and also to give the court the flexibility and discretion to consider any legitimate concerns raised by any party to the proceedings. While we do not expect objections to be lodged or granted very often, there is clearly a possibility that there may be legitimate concerns about the particular special measure to be used. Therefore, and we consider that there should be a way of raising that with the court. And I certainly understand the concerns around how these proposals may operate in practice. As I have it, by all means.
Malcolm Chisholm.
So is the Cabinet Secretary saying that the existing law is not compatible with ECHR? And what does he have to say to the Children's Commissioner and I believe others who say that there is no ECHR issue with regard to children, for example?
Cabinet Secretary.
We wouldn't have laws in this country that weren't compatible with ECHR because of the nature of how this Parliament is established. So I think I can assure Mr Chisholm of that. Equally, what we do wish to ensure is that those who may seek to challenge this legislation in respect of the rights of an individual, perhaps facing a charge, are able to be dealt with. Equally, what we are looking to do is to work through a way in which we balance that right of the accused that would be used very rarely, but which has the, I think, opportunity for their agents to raise the matter with the court for the judiciary ultimately to preside. That won't take away from the clear intention and indeed delivery in this bill of making sure that vulnerable witnesses and indeed witnesses have the right to express themselves. So I think I can satisfy him that no matters will be made worse in terms of what he refers to in terms of children's hearings. Equally, I think we will provide an opportunity to build upon the good work that will be provided for vulnerable witnesses, equally balancing it with a very few number of cases where there may be a legitimate right at least to put that objection ultimately to be considered by the judiciary. So I've advised the committee I'll give further consideration to this issue, and I can confirm that my officials have begun discussions with the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service. By all means.
Jenny Mara.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for giving way. I mean, would the Cabinet Secretary share the concerns of organisations like Scottish Women's Aid that the challenge to the use of special measures may actually increase circumstances of anxiety and reduce confidence among witnesses about giving their evidence in court?
Cabinet Secretary.
No, I don't believe so. I think overall this will provide the clear desire of what these agencies want, and I met with Scottish Women's Aid just recently. It will provide that, but to ensure compliance, to ensure that we provide some safety net, then I do think that this matter can be dealt with appropriately in balance, which is why, as I say, we've started discussions, but I can give Ms Mara the assurance these discussions will not simply be with Crown, but they will also be with agencies such as Scottish Women's Aid to ensure that we reach the right balance. In relation to proposals in the bill to put a duty on justice organisations to set out standards of service for victims and witnesses, the committee suggested that the actual standards should be set out in statutory guidance to be approved by Parliament, along with details of a reporting mechanism. While it would be possible to set out each individual set of standards in this way, I've been very clear that these must be organisation-specific, and I'm concerned that such an approach would slow down the establishment of the standards, and I'm satisfied that the organisations will work together with input from victim support organisations to create robust sets of standards without the need for further parliamentary scrutiny. However, as I've noted to the committee, I am willing to consider further whether there should be a more formal reporting mechanism to monitor how the standards are working in practice, and will discuss this with our justice partners. Finally, I was pleased to note the committee's view that a compelling case has not been made in relation to the establishment of a Victims Commissioner. This is a view I share, along with several victim support organisations, including Victim Support Scotland and Scottish Women's Aid. Given the excellent work carried out by our victim support organisations in Scotland, I continue to believe that the establishment of such a post would simply be a duplication of effort and an extra layer of bureaucracy that our limited resources would be better used in directly helping victims of crime. I would now like to turn to provision in the bill for the establishment and operation of the National Confidential Forum. Again, I'd like to thank the Health and Sport Committee for their careful and thoughtful scrutiny. I'd also like to thank the witnesses who provided evidence, in particular former residents of childcare institutions who have shown great fortitude in coming forward to share their views. We've listened with great care and attention to those views which will help ensure that the National Confidential Forum makes a real difference to the lives of people placed in institutional care as children, by helping to remove their health and well-being and by helping to improve their health and well-being and contributing to the improvement of provision and support to looked after children. And I'm delighted that there's widespread support for the establishment of the forum. I'm also heartened by the recognition of the value of acknowledgement to people who were placed in institutional care as children, in particular survivors of abuse and neglect. Those survivors have been asking for their experiences to be heard and acknowledged for many years, and we are responding. In 2010, we established the Time to be Heard pilot for people placed in Quarriers Village as children. This pilot forum, which only operated for a matter of months, was attended by nearly 100 former residents. The independent evaluation of the experience showed clearly that it was of positive value and benefit to those who took part, and they felt heard and believed. It is our intention with this bill to extend that opportunity to all people placed in institutional care as children in Scotland. The experience of Time to be Heard clearly demonstrates that acknowledgement is of value and is most certainly not a second-class option. The experience also shows that the benefits to people of acknowledgement are not contingent on access to justice remedies. For some people, justice remedies hold little appeal, but safe, supported, confidential acknowledgement does. It was the Scottish Government which approached the SHRC in 2009 to develop a human rights framework to inform the development of what has become the NCF. It was this approach which led in turn to the interaction mentioned by several stakeholders who gave evidence. The Scottish Government is participating in the interaction with an open mind. We do not intend to wait for remedies which may arise from the interaction process to take forward the establishment of the NCF.
Cabinet Secretary, that asked you to come to a
Thank you.
conclusion.
People should not be denied the opportunity to provide that acknowledgement and get that benefit. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, I'm sorry I'm being asked to wind up. I welcome the wide support for the bill to date from both Justice and indeed health arguments. We are happy to discuss and debate as you'd expect at stage 1, and indeed that option is open to Ms Mara, indeed out with the Chamber, or indeed, as I say, at a future matter. And I thank the Deputy Presiding Officer for her indulgence.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. I now call on Christine Graham, who is going to speak on behalf of the Justice Committee. 9 minutes.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. As you say, I speak in this debate on behalf of the Justice Committee, the lead committee in consideration of this bill. But can I just put something on the record before that? And I think I feel a letter to Standards and Procedures coming on. I've never understood why, in a stage 1 debate, The Cabinet Secretary Minister gives a response to the convener's report on behalf of the committee before the convener has reported to the Chamber. It would have been much more useful if I got to say my stuff and then you had got to say, if you'll forgive me saying, Cabinet Secretary, your response afterwards. So much is probably preempted, but off I go anyway. So the two main purposes of the bill. The first was to improve the experience of victims and witnesses, the focus of our committee's consideration. The second, to create the National Confidential Forum, was examined by my colleague Duncan McNeill's committee, the Health and Sport Committee, and I know he's going to speak on that, as will other members. And the committee, my committee, has already written to Health and Sport saying we anticipate they should do stage 2, as we took no evidence in respect of that part. That seems an appropriate division of the bill. Can I too thank all those who provided written submissions, gave oral evidence to the committee, and indeed to the committee members. Always a pleasure to chair the Justice Committee. That's a brownie point for me. Can I also thank all those victims who spoke to the committee members about their individual experiences of the criminal justice system during a specially arranged private and informal discussion. Key themes from that session were reflected by the committee during its formal scrutiny of the bill and our report, and I know how difficult it was for those people to speak to us about their experiences. In fact, for many, although that happened 5 and 10 years previously, they were reliving them, so it showed you the pain of the event, and the experience of the justice system had certainly just gone below the surface. The committee, as the Cabinet Secretary has said, I won't say that more than once, supports the general principles of the bill. We do believe that it provides much needed support and protection for victims and witnesses. Many people never in their lives hope to be in a court in those positions, and of course it's an extraordinarily difficult experience for them. Stage 1 report, however, as it should, highlights a number of areas that could be improved to ensure, in particular, and I know this is difficult for anyone, but the rights of both the accused and those of victims and witnesses are balanced appropriately. Highlighting some of these issues, I will touch on them now. You've touched on definition of the victim. We were concerned, as you know, Cabinet Secretary, along with the Faculty of Advocates, that the innocence of the accused might be compromised, and suggested the term complainer be used as it is in certain sections of the Criminal Procedure Scotland Act 1995. You've rejected that in your response. I think we still would have concerns about it, but I'll leave members to raise that in the general discussion on the debate. On the general principles, there was broad support to certain criminal justice bodies to follow in their dealing with victims and witnesses. But one provision caused particular confusion and concern, and I think it would to the general public, and that was the right for victims as witnesses, as far as would be appropriate to do so, to participate effectively in investigations and proceedings. And victim support went so far as to suggest that the provision should be struck from the bill. I'm quoting those last 4 words. I think there are concerns that that would actually lead people to expectations that would never ever be fulfilled and were never going to be intended to be fulfilled. So I note that we will be looking at a more detailed and practical explanation of how they are expected to be involved in this process. Communication with victims and witnesses is very, very important, and it's not as effective or as coordinated as it should be. Victim support told the committee that victims have to tell the story around 16 times during the course of reporting a crime through to the trial process. That should not happen. The committee therefore believes that individuals working in the criminal justice system should be properly trained to show sensitivity and respect in communications with victims, and that the written information provided must be in key words, plain English. Although continuity in the support provided across the system is needed, we did not believe a compelling case had been made, as you have said, Cabinet Secretary, for the introduction of case companions or the establishment of victims commissioner. On case companions, it's quite a practical thing. You know, how can you have a person always available as a case companion to liaise with a witness or a victim? But we certainly thought there should be continuity of personnel in keeping them informed. I hope you're not going to challenge me. This is your report.
Jenny Mara.
I'm not going to challenge you, convener, but the evidence we heard from the victims of crime I think compellingly showed that they were in favour of not telling their story again and again to different people in the criminal justice system, and were looking for some point of contact that had continuity and a one go-to person. Would the convener agree with me that that was the message from the victims?
Can I remind members to speak through the chair? Christine Graham.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yes, I think I'm looking at what we said. Witnesses asked for continuity and the support provided across the system. That's the important part, but one person allocated. I think we all agreed that it just was not going to be practicable. I've lost my place. Right. The online hub to victims, which was also something suggested to give victims access to information about their individual case, not a bad thing. But that shouldn't replace the human touch, because we need something. There's a bit of TLC has to go on with victims and witnesses, so it's not just good enough to have a hub. And again, in plain English, and not for them what will be legal jargon that the lawyers understand, the court understands, the police understand, but means nothing to those civilians engaged in the process. Vulnerable witnesses, I'll be very brief. There was particular concern that the bill would allow objections to child witnesses accessing measures to protect them. We had concern that the removal of the presumption that child witnesses under the age of 12 should give evidence away from court. That presumption must not have the unintended consequence of having children giving evidence in court against their will. We just flag it up as a little bit of an orange light. We appreciate there may be absolutely justifiable practical reasons why the police could not comply with a witness request to specify the gender of their interviewer, but we suggest that where this is not possible, then a full explanation is provided to the person concerned and included in the report to the PF, so everybody knows where they are about why it couldn't happen. Compensation orders, we saw there could be merits, but they could be counterproductive and be distressing for victims to be, as it were, offered money from an offender. And so we suggest that this should be dealt with sensitively by making sure that what the victim wants is this in the first place. Restitution orders. We asked the Scottish Government to give further consideration to the merits of the proposal in the bill to introduce restitution orders. We accept that police officers and staff are at disproportionate risk of being assaulted while at work, but we believe that introducing restitution orders for police officers and not for other occupations could prove divisive. Where would one draw the line? Firefighters, ambulance staff, teachers, shopkeepers? So there were difficulties, and I know these are already aired in the press. Parole. Just as with participating effectively in a case should not lead to heightened expectations, similarly with the level of influence a victim can have with regard to any representations they make to the parole board, because they may think they've more influence than they're actually going to have, and that would be unfair and wrong. So we recommend guidance so that no one misunderstands the position. Road death victims, I'll leave to other people to deal with. We were hoping that you could get something into the bill. We actually recommended a statutory requirement to give people a right to ask, not necessarily a right to receive everything, but a right to ask for all information relating to a member of the family or a loved one's death in a road traffic accident. Others can develop that. In conclusion, we support the bill. We've identified a number of recommendations to improve certain provisions with a view to ensuring the rights of both the accused and those of victims and witnesses are balanced appropriately, and that's terribly important. I've touched on some of these today, and I'm sure other members of the committee will pick up on some of the aspects of the bill I've not had time to cover, and I look forward to hearing other contributions in the debate.
Thank you very much. And I now call on Duncan McNeill, who is going to speak on behalf of the Health and Sport Committee. 7 minutes, Mr McNeill.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. And I also would like to express my thanks and appreciation for all of those who allowed us to do our job in support of the Justice Committee in taking this issue forward, and with a particular focus on the National Confidential Forum. It must be said, I suppose, that it wasn't without challenges, because people didn't see that split, and it's worth noting that the justice aspects of the forum posed some difficulties in terms of taking evidence, and on one hand, our focus as a committee was clearly on health and well-being. On the other, a number of witnesses suggested to us that the absence of accountability was, for some survivors, in itself proved detrimental to their health and well-being. So there was a difficulty there. But we did not ignore the justice-related issues as we heard them and listened to them. But I think we had to make it clear to the witnesses that in issues such as time bar, consultation, we never looked at those issues in depth. We heard and listened and recorded their evidence in that, and would respectfully suggest that it would be more appropriate if these matters need dealt with, that should be the justice aspect. So I'll therefore concentrate my remarks on our committee's work and with a particular focus on the National Confidential Forum. Sorry is the very hardest word, Deputy Presiding Officer, and even more difficult than saying the word is acting upon it. 9 years ago, Jack McConnell stood just over there and offered a full apology to adult survivors of childhood abuse. The then First Minister said, "We in the Parliament, on behalf of the people of Scotland, recognised that they were wronged and that we will do more to support them in the future than we have ever done in the past." The National Confidential Forum will provide a voice to some who until now have been denied the right to have their say. One participant in the Time to Be Heard pilot forum told of their experience of abuse in a children's home in the 1940s. 70 years to shoulder that burden alone. It's unimaginable. The forum will meet the needs of some people, certainly, but we know that will not satisfy everyone. The expectations we found of the survivor community are high. And anyone who has spent time with those survivors, as we did in our engagement, can tell you that they place a great value on trust. But it's fragile. People have been promised help in the past only to be let down. We were pleased, therefore, to hear that the Scottish Government is contributing to the interactive process. There is also activity on civil litigation, time bar and other justice-related issues being taken forward out with our committee. That momentum, I'm sure we all agree, must be maintained if the interests of all survivors are to be served. The committee heard evidence in stage 1 from individuals, survivor groups, children's organisations, care providers, regulators and human rights experts. And one witness told us, survivors will judge the process, the bill, the act and the National Confidential Forum on the personal outcomes of them. For those who choose to participate in the forum, it is crucial, absolutely crucial, we heard time and time again, that support is provided before, in terms of the expectation and what they expect out of it, what the process will be. During that process, there needs to be an element of support, and indeed after that process, because we heard that there is a real risk of re-traumatisation as a result of that. The other issue we took evidence was the exclusion of those who had been in foster care. And we would like to see that part of the eligibility criteria given further consideration. Kathleen Marshall, who was involved in the Time to Be Heard pilot and indeed the former Children's Commissioner, told us it was an area from which there was most to learn. And learning lessons was something of a theme in what we heard. The Care Leavers Association said measures and outcomes were fine and well, but a life in care and beyond is much bigger than that. This debate brings in the emotional side, the love, the care, the support, and the seriously that is seriously lacking in our current care system. How the work of the Forum will inform and practice that system now and in the future is not entirely clear from the bill. The Centre of Excellence for Looked After Children in Scotland asked for more detail. Perhaps the Minister will be able to elaborate later. And I hope that the other point that will be taken up, courtesy of the Scottish Church of Scotland, to explore links between Forum and the care providers. And we took other evidence on that as well. Deputy Presiding Officer, we acknowledge the wider approach taken by the Scottish Government via its survivor strategy. We recognise that access to counselling, support, mental health services and advocacy is crucial. What we drew from the evidence was the need for a choice of accessible services, long-term support and skilled mental health workforce. The Health and Sport Committee welcomes the therapeutic value of the National Confidential Forum will bring. We recall that apology from the First Minister in 2004 and pledged to do more to help those abused as children in care of the state. There is a moral imperative here. A tailored choice of therapeutic supports and other remedies should be available to survivors.
Mr McNeill, you must conclude.
Call it a personal-centred approach if you must. Call it the right thing to do if you like. Call it not before time if you will. But action is necessary and going forward and we support the stage 1 of the bill.
Many thanks. I now call on Jenny Marra. Maximum 9 minutes, please.
Presiding Officer, Labour is happy to support the Government motion today and the general principles of the Victims and Witnesses Bill. Earlier this year at Scottish Labour Party conference in Inverness, we were privileged to hear Helen Richardson's journey through the Scottish justice system as the immediate family member of a victim of crime. In 2010, Helen's sister was murdered in her own Angus home, turning the lives of Helen and her family upside down. During her powerful speech that day, Helen detailed her frustration as she moved through disjointed, confusing and protracted processes in the justice system at a time of great anxiety and grief. We cannot escape the need for those like Helen to assist in the disposal of justice, but in recognising her duty to the justice system, we must recognise our responsibility to provide victims and witnesses with the knowledge and support that they need as well. And while we agree with the underpinning principles of this bill, we do not believe it goes far enough in practice to offer that level of support. Take, for example, measures to supply more information to victims and witnesses. The bill seeks to improve the information flow to victims and witnesses by placing a duty on the Procurator Fiscal, the Scottish Court Service and Police Scotland to disclose case-specific information. And while we recognise these measures will make more information available, as the Crown Office had made clear that information will only be useful if it can be understood by the victim or witness receiving it. Furthermore, changes like those relating to victim statements in court or to victim and witness representations to the parole board, all the while giving greater flexibility, will inevitably demand more answers and decisions from victims and witnesses. And for that reason, Scottish Labour's proposal for case companions is, I believe, a compelling one. As a single point of contact, a case companion would be assigned to a victim or witness from the moment they are identified and for as long as their interaction with the justice system lasts. They would be a central point of information and guidance, whether they are appointed as a third-party provider or indeed internally within the justice system. And we believe that those case companions best embody the letter and spirit of the European Union directive that has brought us to this chamber today. Because that legislation says member states should consider developing sole points of access or one-stop shops that address victims' multiple needs when involved in criminal proceedings, including the need to receive information, assistance, support, protection and compensation. Yes.
Christine Graham.
Confirm the position, Ms Jenny Mara, because you did sign up to, on balance, the committee does not believe a compelling case has been made in support of the introduction of case companions. That was what's changed.
Jenny Mara.
Presiding Officer, the committee reports are always agreed by committee, but Scottish Labour thinks that there is a compelling case for case companions. As the government is legislating to expand the choices and information given to victims and witnesses, so too are they legislating to expand the need for guidance and support to make those choices. In order to make his changes as meaningful as possible, I hope the Cabinet Secretary rethinks our call for case companions. One area of concern we have with the bill is with its monitoring and reporting procedures. Yes.
John Finney.
Presiding Officer, I'm grateful for the member taking intervention. I wonder, given your strength of feeling in this issue, whether you thought it was appropriate to have a minority entry put in the report, because the position outlined by the convener is entirely accurate.
Jenny Mara.
As I said in response to the convener, Presiding Officer, these reports are always agreed by committee, and I think we made our point in committee that we thought case companions were a good idea. Stuart Maxwell's shaking his head, but he wasn't there to hear the discussions. I was saying that one area of concern we have with the bill is with its monitoring and reporting procedures, and these are concerns that were raised during the Justice Committee evidence sessions and are reflected in the committee report. Scottish Labour believes that the best way to achieve effective performance monitoring is through a fully independent Victims Commissioner, which the Cabinet Secretary alluded to in his opening remarks. Creating such a role would ensure transparent, independent and focused oversight of a complex system. It would... Presiding Officer, no, I'm not, because
the member's not giving way. Can we have order, please?
Officer,
Jenny Mara.
Can I clarify that I'm speaking from the Labour Party's position? I'm not speaking on behalf of the committee. Creating such a role would ensure transparent, independent and focused oversight of a complex system.
Mr Patterson, can we have order, please, in the chamber to hear the member? Jenny Mara.
Creating such a role as a Victims Commissioner would ensure transparent, independent and focused oversight of a complex system. It would do so exclusively through the eyes of victims and witnesses, lending a powerful voice to their cause. When my colleague Dave Stewart consulted on the proposal in 2009, it gained a favourable 77% support from organisations, including Victim Support Scotland, who said, "We look forward to seeing the development of the new office and hope it will play an active, tangible role in the protection and promotion of victims' rights in Scotland." So again, I hope our call for a Victims Commissioner is considered more fully by the Government as the bill moves forward. I want to turn to one important provision that I believe is missing from the bill, which has been highlighted by Rape Crisis Scotland. That is the right of complainers of sexual offences to access legal advice when records of their sexual history, character or medical records are requested by the defence. Currently, complainers do not have a right to actively participate in this process or to challenge any application. Victims are then reluctant to come forward because they do not want their personal lives subject to intense scrutiny against their will. And therefore, I would appreciate the Minister commenting on Rape Crisis Scotland's suggestion of affording complainers of sexual offences legal representation when matters of their sexual history, medical records or character are requested by the defence. We have concerns, as the convener said, around the use of the word victim throughout the bill and its impact on the presumption of innocence that is a cornerstone of our legal system. Similarly, the provision for victims to participate effectively in an investigation and proceedings remain ambiguous at best. As Murdo MacLeod QC stated in his evidence, he could only imagine that it means people can effectively participate in terms of giving evidence, and he said, beyond that, I have no idea what the provision means. I think the Government have yet to address the concerns of the committee that the provision may falsely raise expectations of victims. And while we sympathise with the idea of a victim's surcharge, it is vital it does not become a substitute for properly funded victim services.
Order. There's conversations taking place in the chamber and the member's trying to make her speech. Ms Mara.
We would therefore appreciate assurances, firstly, that it is feasible to collect the money, and secondly, that it won't simply be used to plug holes in a decreasing justice budget. In conclusion, we have an opportunity to make a real difference to the lives of victims and witnesses of crime with this bill. But we believe that the government should do more to clarify the points that I have raised and provide greater support and better oversight for victims and the organisations that support them. And while we agree with the principles, there is still more work that can be done, and I look forward to working with the government at stage 2 and 3 of this bill to address them.
Thank you very much. I now call on John Lamont. 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I also welcome the opportunity to speak at this Stage 1 debate on the Victims and Witnesses Scotland Bill. The Justice Committee has spent a lot of time considering this bill and gathering the views of all of those involved in the justice system, including, as we've heard already from the convener, evidence in private from individual victims during which they recounted their own experiences. There is consensus that more needs to be done for victims of crime, and that more can be done to ensure that victims are put in their rightful place, which must be at the heart of the justice system. I therefore very much welcome this bill, and this will be supported at stage 1 by the Scottish Conservatives. Deputy Presiding Officer, this bill will go a fair way to help those unlucky enough to be affected by crime. Some of the most useful measures included are, firstly, the introduction of a victim's surcharge, which will mean offenders contribute to supporting those affected by crime. Secondly, the creation of a right for victims and witnesses to access certain information about their case and the widening of special measures available to witnesses deemed vulnerable. Thirdly, the right to choose the gender of an interviewer in sexual offences and domestic abuse cases. And fourthly, the creation of police restitution orders to help support officers injured in the line of duty. The Scottish Government is to be commended for introducing a bill dedicated to victims and witnesses, and is something which has not happened in Scotland before. However, the committee considered a number of suggestions for improving the bill, which I hope the Government will reflect upon. Perhaps most significantly, we heard from a number of witnesses that, despite conferring rights on victims, the bill does not include a definition of the term victim. This would appear to me to be a pretty glaring omission, and I hope the Government can come forward with a definition which will provide clarity whilst also protecting the right to a fair trial. The bill also extends entitlement to special measures available to victims who are deemed vulnerable. These are important measures which can make it easier for witnesses to give evidence, but the bill also introduces a right for parties to object to the use of standard special measures in all cases. This was welcomed by lawyers, but it was of great concern to Victim Support Scotland and the Children's Commissioner because it introduced uncertainty for vulnerable witnesses over whether support offered to them will be challenged and possibly withdrawn. To seek a solution which is acceptable by victims and prosecutors alike must be one of the priorities as the bill progresses. We also heard concerns over Section 3(4), which allows the police, court service and Crown to withhold information requested by victims if they consider it inappropriate to release that information. The Government should consider whether this needs amending, or at the very least provide clear guidance on what factors should be taken into account when considering the appropriateness of disclosing this type of information. More generally, the committee heard that communication between justice bodies was poor and that this was causing problems. Astonishingly, David McKenna of Victim Support Scotland suggested that victims had to tell their story around 16 times to various agencies, which is clearly unnecessary and can add to victims' distress. Some of the evidence received painted a less than enthusiastic picture of the bill, however. It's worth pointing out that this legislation will only bring Scotland up to the minimum standards required by the EU Directive on Victims and Witnesses. In some aspects, it arguably falls short of this minimum standard too, for example, not establishing a formal right to review a decision not to prosecute. Campaigner for victims' rights Peter Morris wrote about his disappointment with the bill in his evidence when he said, "To say that this legislation as it stands will make any significant difference to victims' lives is just not true. To say that this legislation is radical is not true, and to say that this now puts victims at the heart of the justice system is also not true. The Scottish Conservative priority, therefore, is to strengthen this bill so that it does more and goes further to improving the lot of victims and witnesses. For example, the victim surcharge should apply to all offenders so that we are not in the situation where motorists have to contribute but violent offenders do not. And just 10 days ago, the Sunday Post reported that sex offenders who had been placed on the register for life, but who now have the right to challenge this, were being taken off the register without their victims being informed. The bill gives victims of life prisoners a right to be notified when the offender is released. I believe the same right should be granted to the victims of sex offenders who were put on the register for life but are now being taken off. So the bill can be criticised for being modest, but the elephant in the room is this. Even if the victim is much better and more swiftly informed about the process, even if they're given more support throughout and are able to make a more meaningful role before a conviction is secured, all of this is cold comfort to the victim if the prison sentence imposed is nothing like the prison sentence served. Automatic early release of prisoners, which the SNP promised to abolish in 2007, is a scandal. It disserves the victim, it discredits the system, and it destroys public confidence. The Scottish Government's claim that it wants to stand up for victims would be more credible if they didn't continue to allow the vast majority of offenders to be released from prison after serving only half their sentence. Whilst I fully accept it was a UK government which introduced automatic early release, they quickly realised the error of this system and so left a repeal of early release on the statute books in 1997. This was ignored by the incoming UK Labour government, just as numerous calls from the Scottish Conservatives to end automatic early release have been ignored by this SNP government. And where was the consideration of victims when the Scottish Government and the SNP members of the Justice Committee pushed through the closure of a fifth of our sheriff courts? These closures may save the court service some money, but will pass on costs to victims and witnesses.
The member's just concluding, I'm
more
afraid.
delays in a clogged-up justice system. So yes, this bill is a welcome step forward, but the Scottish Government should not forget that some of its other actions in relation to our justice system will also impact on the victims of crime.
Thank you very much. As members may have guessed, we're very tight for time. We turn to the open debate, speeches of 6 minutes maximum. Sandra White, to be followed by Malcolm Chisholm.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And can I just say I'm a bit confused with Jenny Mara's remarks. I wonder, now that we're at committee, that anything that Jenny Mara or the Labour members mention at committee, it won't be the Labour Party's position. And I also say to Jenny Mara, you could have recorded your dissent if you felt so hard against that. So I just want to put that point across. I just want
Order. Can members speak through the chair, please?
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I would also, as others have done, like to thank the many individuals and organisations who took part in the consultation, the committee clerks for their support, and I also want to thank the Health Committee for their work. And although as a Justice Committee member I didn't take part in the investigation, I have been involved from the very beginning when the petition was presented to the Petitions Committee, and I'm really pleased that it's went so far, and I congratulate Duncan McNeill on his contribution, which I thought was absolutely wonderful, I must say. Presiding Officer, the Victim and Witnesses Scotland Bill is proposed legislation aimed at improving support for victims and witnesses as they encounter and move through the criminal justice system, and the aims of this bill are to be welcomed, and in particular, and I quote page 5 of Justice Committee report background to the bill, and this is in quotes. The reason we need to have this bill is against the backdrop of a growing public perception that the balance of rights is tipped in favour of the accused, and that is in the official report. And I think that's why it's so important that we talk about the Victim and Witnesses Bill. Now, many people may say that what I've just said and what's actually in the report may not be correct, but in the eyes of the public and the evidence we've certainly heard and received, the general public, victims and witnesses certainly needed to be made aware of court proceedings, more involvement with key stakeholders and access to information, support, protection and above all treated with respect. Now, many people who came and gave evidence felt that they did not receive this through the justice system. Now, there are many areas to be covered in this particular bill, Presiding Officer. However, I want to concentrate on a couple of issues as time is short. Now, much has been made of the definition of victim, And everyone here has used the word victim. And indeed, I remember during one of many of the committee meetings, I'm sure other members remember also, more time is given over and being taken up by members debating this very term. Should it be a victim or a complainer? And I can only repeat what I said at the committee meetings. If a crime is committed to me or anyone else, I'm a victim, not a complainer. And I note, and this was raised by Jenny Marder when I asked this question, and I note that the Criminal Procedure Scotland Act 1995 uses the word complainer. However, as most of the general public are not lawyers, and if the crime is committed against them, they are victims. And that's why it's called the Victim and Witnesses Bill. And I draw people's attention to that. And I'm pleased at the committee's recommendation which recognises this. And I do take on board the comments made by the Cabinet Secretary and the clarity in this particular area. And I know that, I think most people would know this, it's not just a victim of a crime which is affected, it's the victims' families and loved ones. And I know that Willie Coffey, my colleague, will highlight in this particular area once again. Now, I raise this point more than once in regards to the word victim and not complainer, because, as I said before, we discussed this for a long, long time, probably more than any other part of the bill. And I do have concerns if this particular terminology is to be on the face of the bill. The length of time we took to discuss what is the meaning of victim, how long is it going to take discussions before it even takes part to go on the face of the bill? So I just wanted to highlight that particular point also. Now, I welcome measures being taken to protect vulnerable witnesses and encourage them to take part in court procedures, and in particular the live television links, use of the screens, use of a supporter, and in particular the inclusion of sexual offences, domestic abuse, human trafficking and stalking, which will ensure that these victims will be automatically entitled to use standard special measures when giving evidence. And I would ask the Cabinet Secretary on the subject of trafficking if he is minded or would look at to extend powers of the bill to include further measures of protection for victims of human trafficking, and in particular children who have been trafficked. Now, I raise a point, and others have raised it also, of the letter from VOCFS and the Children's Commission that was referred to by Jenny Marder, and their objections that both parties have the right to object to special measures being used when giving evidence, and their call for the removal of sections 9 and 13 from the bill. Now, I let others take on board what they say. However, I do believe and understand that a balance has to be struck, and that vulnerable witnesses should and will be identified at an early stage. Special measures, if needed, will and should be explained to the witnesses as early as possible, and also welcome the Cabinet Secretary's response to these issues in his earlier statements. Now, Presiding Officer, I look forward to possessing this bill throughout Parliament. There are many good provisions throughout this bill, and we've heard already about them, and we'll hear more later as well. And we'll also hear concerns raised by other members, and that's the way it should be when we're in debate, and particularly at stage 1. But the overall principle of this bill is to ensure that victims and witnesses receive support, feel able to participate in the justice system, and I believe this bill will give them that opportunity and enable them to do so. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Many thanks. I call Malcolm Chisholm to be followed by Colin Keir.
Presiding Officer, I agree with the principles and much else that's in the bill, but I'll concentrate on areas where I think it could have gone further. I think the standards mentioned in section 2 are a case in point. I believe those standards need to be consulted on with victims' organisations and others. I believe they need to be in regulations, and I believe that they should be reported on. But more than that, I think the standards and other parts of the bill do raise for me a fundamental question. How are they going to be policed, and who is going to ensure that they are enforced? In some other countries, victims can go to court if they feel their rights have been abused, but what recourse will there be for victims in Scotland? And it's that fundamental question that has led to the proposal from the Labour Party for a Victims Commissioner. Now, we can argue about the remit of that Victims Commissioner, and Jenny Marra, I would agree with what she said about a Commissioner achieving effective performance monitoring. I myself would like to see the Commissioner take on some of an Ombudsman's role, so that if somebody did have an example of where they had not been treated properly by the system, they could go to that individual to get some recourse. So I do think those who are opposed to the Commissioner, it's up to them to say how would they answer that fundamental question about how will the bill be policed and who is going to ensure that it is enforced.
Christine Graham.
the member like me has been in Parliament a very long time, and you can see why we're a bit taken aback. I think I speak for the rest of the committee to find out now that the position on the Labour benches is that you want a Victims Commissioner and a case companion. This was not dealt with at committee. The objection to that could be put in our report. That is not in our report. The position, as I understood it when I stood on my feet to speak for the committee, was unanimously opposed at this point, on balance, to a Victims Commissioner or a case companion.
Malcolm Chisholm.
You know the process.
I do object to such a long intervention. I wouldn't have given way of opinion. That is a procedural point. That is not a substantive point. And if I can give one small example, wasting more time of my speech, I did not vote against the Finance Committee's report, the recommendation that there should not be energy efficiency measures in the land building transaction tax at committee, but I still moved that position in an amendment. And it is perfectly possible to take a position at a subsequent stage that you have not pushed to a vote in committee. I've now wasted a minute of my speech, which I bitterly regret. Now, I also agree with the proposal that there should be more information for victims and witnesses, although I note in section 3 that information about bail and bail conditions is not mentioned, which is often complained about. But again, I believe the best way to provide that information is through a single point of contact, providing continuity of support as far as possible. It will not always be possible, but I think the principle of a case companion is absolutely right. Now, I'm not going to give way again, I'm sorry, but I've already lost a minute because of that previous one. Also, while more information for victims and witnesses is good for them, what is not good is publicly available information about victims and witnesses. And I note what Victims Support Scotland said about let's have some control of how the media report on victims and witnesses. That is hard to do. I would also mention something I mentioned in the debate last June about my constituent whose personal details were all published on the Scottish Court Service website following a divorce case. Now, this is still ongoing. I've had 2 meetings with the Assistant Information Commissioner, that's the Data Protection Commissioner, about this, and I'm still waiting a further reply from the Scottish Court Service. But what has emerged is that the judiciary is not subject to the Data Protection Act. The Sheriff said the details could go on, including intimate details, including bank details, and it seems to me, although that the principle of judicial independence is good in practice, it sometimes goes too far, and that court judgment going on the website made my constituent a victim. Apart from anything else, she was stalked as a result of it. Now, I have to be very quick now because I've only got 2 minutes left. I welcome the extension of special measures for victims of sexual offences and domestic abuse. But again, I note that Victim Support Scotland said their greatest concern about the bill was the right of a party to object to that. That is not the case now, which was what led to my intervention about, does that mean current legislation is against ECHR? If ECHR is being invoked, the Children Commissioner says clearly it is not against ECHR, and Scottish Women's Aid and Rape Crisis say the same. Now, there are many points about the bill that Scottish Women's Aid and Rape Crisis have made. I don't think I've probably got time to go over them all, but they are certainly issues that I would like to see questioned at stages 2 and 3. The right of the complainer to access legal advice when records of sexual history or character or medical records are requested by the defence. Secondly, the right to request a review if there is no prosecution proceeding. Remember, only 25% of rape complainers are carried forward. Special measures they would like to see extended to civil cases, which is often where domestic abuse and sexual offences are heard. The right to choose the gender of a forensic examiner. Also, the Section 20 should be amended to make clear that there should not be a compensation order when that is contrary to the victim's wishes. So those are all concerns from either Scottish Women's Aid or Rape Crisis Scotland, which I would support. And now I have 40 seconds for the National Confidential Forum. I note and agree with what Duncan McNeill said, many positive features of it, but it should include those who have been in foster care. Many of the witnesses said that, and should also have a wider mandate and remit. And I noticed the section 95 in the Health Committee report, which quoted the Scottish Human Rights Commission saying it could not identify another initiative in the world that dealt only with acknowledgement and no other elements of remedy, whether inquiry-related, civil law focused or reparation based. And my last point is, I note the concern of the Health Committee about the extent of knowledge and expertise of mental health professionals in this area. That reminds me of a report that I launched, I think, 12 years ago, probably by Sarah Nelson, which said exactly the same thing. It was psychiatrists at that point who had no awareness of sexual abuse issues. I hope that's changed in the interim, but the Health Committee's report suggests that perhaps it hasn't changed as much as we would like to see.
Thank you very much. I now call Colin Keir to be followed by Alison McInnes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I have to say that this bill has been one of the most interesting pieces of legislation to work on in my time in the Justice Committee, and I believe many of my colleagues do feel the same way. The submissions provided by the individuals and groups have shown the real effect on real people affected by crime and their journey through the justice system, not necessarily as the victim directly affected by crime, but those who are victims because they've lost loved ones as a result of crime or negligence. As mentioned by Christine Graham, perhaps the most informative session held by the Justice Committee was the roundtable events held in private in which victims of crime attended and gave their stories, experiences and their comments about the justice system. Some of what we heard was quite harrowing. Some negative experiences I felt could have been avoided merely by the authorities using a degree of common sense. Of course, it's difficult not to leave such a session like the roundtable event and start demanding wholesale change, such was the effect of some of these traumatic stories. But of course, justice must be balanced, and I hope at this stage one report strikes a good balance as a starting point in identifying the necessary reforms to the way we deal with victims and witnesses in the Scottish justice system. As mentioned by the Cabinet Secretary and highlighted by Malcolm Chisholm, it's only reasonable for those who enter the justice system to expect a standard of care and service that doesn't make a very difficult situation even more traumatic. As we've heard, many victims and witnesses felt that every time they moved further down the chain of the justice system, they had to describe and relive their experiences to a different official. I believe this problem can be avoided, but obviously, the majority of colleagues in the Justice Committee, I am not minded to support the idea of a case companion. Like others, I would like to be able to ensure that the victim has the right to be questioned by someone of the same gender, a particularly obvious request in regards of serious sexual assault cases. I do, however, take on board that due to other matters such as shift work patterns and court work within the police service, this may be difficult to achieve all time. I am, however, content with the assurances given by Police Scotland that every attempt will be made to ensure investigation officers of the same gender will be made available when required. Another difficult position faced is that of who is a vulnerable witness. It's only after hearing from the likes of the Children's Commissioner, Children First and others, that the rather settled view that I perhaps started this legislative journey with has changed slightly, and the difficulties of keeping a truly balanced justice system can be highlighted. I totally agree with making sure, if possible, that vulnerable witnesses, and certainly victims under 12, are given the opportunity to give their testimony away from court. Along with other special measures, the intimidation felt prior and during proceedings, particularly if the victim or witness is a child, can be eased and will help that person's quality of testimony while protecting them from the full force of our adversarial system. This can only be good. However, there are those, of course, who are under 18, have seen the justice system firsthand over a number of years and who are extremely tough nuts to crack. Should these people, in the interests of justice, not be allowed to face interrogation in court because of their age? It's something for discussion. I am of the belief that there is a case for possible challenge to the granting of special measures in some cases. I'm not convinced that one-size-fits-all approach is correct, and however, I would say that caution has to be called for, and as the Stage 1 report points out, clarity of where responsibility lies as to establishing the vulnerability of witnesses is required. One issue that I had some personal difficulty with during discussions was that of relatives of those victims of road traffic accidents obtaining as a matter of right all information relating to the investigation of the fatality. I fully understand the wishes of relatives to obtain information over the loss of a loved one, and I went through the same heartache when my brother Lindsay was killed in a motorcycle accident just over 4 years ago. Of course you want to know what happened, There needs to be closure. In my experience, Strathclyde Police dealt with the problem in an exemplary manner. They showed me the crash scene, went through the details of what happened, as seen by witnesses, taking into consideration the road conditions. And on a personal level, I'm actually quite unclear as to why more detail is required. My problem with full disclosure as a right is that the description and photographs in particular of the accident may be gruesome and rather harrowing in nature. If the Cabinet Secretary is minded to support the idea of allowing full disclosure as a right, will he please ensure that the systems are in place to explain to relatives what is actually in the documents and put it in a sensitive manner? I would suggest that raw data shouldn't just be handed over as a matter of course. There are so many other issues as being put. Well, I'm actually just coming to the end, Ms. Mara. There are so many issues worth discussion in relation to this bill. I say it's fascinating. We've heard a number of other issues which have been brought by other members here, and I think it's a vital bill that hopefully we can maintain cross-party solidarity, and I will most certainly be supporting it at stage 1.
Thank you very much. I now call Alison McInnes to be followed by Christian Allard.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And I too would take the moment to thank the many people and organisations who took the time to respond to the committee's call for evidence on the bill. The Scottish Liberal Democrats welcome the Victims and Witnesses Bill and will be supporting the general principles this evening. It's right that we're seeking to protect and enhance the rights of witnesses and victims of crime. Crime is a story of people whose lives have been adversely affected through the actions of others, and it's vital that when working on justice reforms we do remember that, and that we all do what we can to provide support and protection for those that are affected by crime. We're fortunate in Scotland that we have well-developed voluntary services that people can access, but there's much more to be done. And it's vital that we make sure our laws offer the best possible protection to victims and witnesses in order that support organisations can be at their most effective. I want to focus very briefly on a couple of key points of the bill as it currently stands, and then to touch upon a few things that it doesn't yet cover. Much focus has, quite rightly I think, been on the proposed improvements for vulnerable witnesses, and other members have spoken about that this afternoon. I welcome in particular the right to an individual assessment for all vulnerable witnesses to determine the most appropriate special measures to assist them. And the widening of those eligible for special measures is also to be welcomed. But we must acknowledge that there is dismay amongst victims and those speaking for them about the proposals to allow objections to special measures. In particular, the Victims Organisations Collaboration Forum in Scotland, VOCFS, and the Commissioner for Children and Young People have challenged us to look again at that matter. VOCFS argues cogently that this not only creates uncertainty for witnesses, but that in the case of children who currently have an automatic entitlement to special measures, it will lead to a dilution of their current protection. They argue that it is illogical on the one hand to extend those eligible for special measures while at the same time allowing challenge. VOCFS goes so far as to say, and I quote, "If implemented, this provision will result in an increase in the number of witnesses re-victimised by the process of going to court. We consider that it will undermine all the other provisions and rights contained in the bill." Now, listen to what the Cabinet Secretary said today in opening the debate about engaging further on this, and I do urge the Cabinet Secretary to give very careful consideration to amending the bill in light of these strong representations. And I think at the very least, the children's rights must be protected and not eroded in any way from what is the current situation. And I would be keen for the committee indeed to take further evidence on section 9 and 13 of the bill at stage 2 if necessary. The other area that has attracted a lot of attention is the so-called victim surcharge. In the debate during the consultation on the bill last year, I mentioned our Liberal Democrats' slight unease with this plan. Our long-term vision is to increase the amount of paid work taking place in prisons, as part of which we could develop a means to allow a contribution to be taken from prisoners' wages and used to help provide additional funding for victim support measures, a move that would re-emphasise the need of all offenders to make reparations over the course of their sentence. Turning to things that aren't in the bill as it stands, At committee, there was some discussion of the creation of a Victims Commissioner, and we've heard that this afternoon, and the introduction of case companions. I understand why these could appear to be a positive measure, however, they each have practical problems. Louise Johnston of Scottish Women's Aid commented on a possible Victims Commissioner, and I quote, "We already have very good links with the Scottish Government, and we have direct links to people at very senior levels in the Crown Office and the police. We do not think that another body's intervention would help us at all. Why should we have to go through an intermediary?" And I agree with that view. Similarly, case companions, while on the face of it might offer a reassuring presence, in practice could cause significant problems with information flow. There are, though, a couple of suggestions that I believe are worthy of further exploring at stage 2. The first of these is on the issue of anonymity orders. These were mentioned in the consultation Cabinet Secretary, but have not made it into the final bill. And there is some thought that, as these are in use in England and Wales, certain issues may arise with cross-border cases. And it was something that I'd be grateful for the Cabinet Secretary's view on, and that we can perhaps return to again. Lastly, I want to mention the brief discussions we had in committee that are mentioned in the report on the right for victims to request a review of the Crown Office decision not to proceed with prosecuting a case. Members will of course be aware that the Director of Public Prosecutions in England and Wales has very recently announced consultation on plans that would enhance the right of appeal against CPS decisions not to prosecute. EU directives make it incumbent on us to ensure that victims have that right to review a decision. Now, I acknowledge the Crown Office's view that their current arrangements are compliant with the directive and that the Crown Agent has commissioned a review to consider whether the arrangements in Scotland can be further enhanced. I don't wish to preempt the outcome of that review, given the importance of the right and the context of this bill, but I am minded to agree with victim support that there is a strong case for us to include the right to review a decision not to prosecute on the face of the bill.
Final 30 seconds.
It's an issue I would hope we could return to. And again, I would welcome further thoughts from the Cabinet Secretary on that matter. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I now call Christian Allard to be followed by Gil Patterson.
Presiding Officer, I wanted first to acknowledge the excellent contribution made to the debate so far. I wanted also to congratulate all the members of the Justice Committee on this Stage 1 report on the victims and witnesses. Unfortunately, I'll have to withdraw my congratulations from one particular member. As a new member of this Parliament, I'm quite astonished that a member of the North East of Scotland has undermined so much the committee of this Parliament. To my mind, I was told when I started in committees that if I sign up a report, I agree with that report. And it will never come to me to come to this chamber and to deny what I just said in committee. However, yes?
I've been a member of this Parliament for 14 years and of another Parliament for 7 years before that, and I did exactly what Jenny Mara did in the land building transaction tax. I let something go through on energy efficiency and then I moved an amendment. So it is not, there are perfectly good reasons for doing that, and I think it's totally unacceptable the way in which there's been a concerted attempt by SNP members to attack Jenny Mara on that issue.
Yeah, if there were a perfectly good reason, I'm sure Ms. Mara would have told us so. There is a lot here that we can all agree on. The general principle of the bill for the legal system in Scotland to have better regards to victims and witnesses, particularly the help and support given to them during, after the investigation or proceedings. This bill aims to improve the experience of victims and witnesses and making justice work for them. The last few weeks, you may have heard several times, Presiding Officer, that I was not born in Scotland. And I have to confess today that English was not my favourite subject at school. I, maybe more than others in the chamber, understand that plain English should be used when informing and supporting victims and witnesses. It is an appropriate language that most of us are able to read and understand wherever we live or come from. I have noted that Tam Bailey, Scotland's Commissioner for Children and Young People, agrees with the principle of the need for good communication with victims and witnesses. When giving evidence to the Justice Committee, Scotland's Commissioner has put on record his general support for the bill. We need to ensure that children and young people are not only heard, but also that we communicate in a way which they can understand. Incidentally, the word victims is the right choice of word for this bill. Families of victims are very sensitive to the language we use. They are a very vulnerable group. Children of victims, in particular, might need help and support for many years. Losing a parent at an early age or losing a child as a parent are very traumatic events, whatever the circumstances. Presiding officer, we've recorded crime in Scotland at its lowest level for 39 years and attempted murder and serious assault down 50% since June 2007. I believe that it is important that the Scottish Government reflects on the need to support families of those killed on our roads. My experience is that families will want an explanation of what happened, particularly if they know or are related to the person responsible for the road fatality. I happen to live in the relatively new town of Weston in Aberdeenshire, a prosperous town where young families settled 2 or 3 decades ago. And because of the disproportionate number of younger people, I have often attended the last 20 years funerals of young people. Many of these funerals, too many of them, are funerals of victims of accidents on our northeast roads. I recognize that when criminal proceedings are ongoing, it is difficult to address the need of the families of those killed on our roads to get the information they require. And I understand that some bereaved families would not wish to receive some of the investigation's material. However, the issue has been raised when the Justice Committee took evidence from families of road death victims, and I will ask the Cabinet Secretary to explore a way to increase the level of information given to families of road death victims. I would like to be reassured that the bill could allow for a statutory requirement to give bereaved families the information they may or not request at the end of criminal proceedings. Again, as with the issue on using appropriate language, ensuring that bereaved families have the right to obtain copies of the investigation papers relating to fatal road deaths is, I believe, good practice and the right thing to do. Presiding officer, let me take this opportunity to congratulate all the organisations and individuals working hard to make our roads safer. The Royal Highland Show this weekend will attract many visitors from our rural communities, and I urge them to stop at the Road Safety Village in the show's lifestyle area. Our country roads account for around 70% of all road fatalities in Scotland, and as a member representing many rural communities in the North East, I will be attending the greatest show on earth to listen to expert advice and information on the road safety. There is a reason...
to a close, please.
Yes, thank you. I'm delighted that the Justice Committee is supporting the general principles of the bill, and I look forward for the response of the Cabinet Secretary. I too believe that this bill will help improve victims' and witnesses' experiences of the criminal justice system in the future.
Many thanks. I now call on Gil Patterson to be followed by Graham Pearson. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thanks very much. Presiding officer, it's just my luck to follow a Frenchman that speaks English better than I do. Can I declare an interest, presiding officer, as I'm a board member of Central Scotland Rape Crisis. One of the matters that this Parliament always deals with in a serious fashion is issues relating to men's violence against women and children. Although this Stage 1 debate and the Stage 1 report are not exclusive to those victims of men's violence against women and children, I will base most of my speech on how this debate relates to men's violence against women and children and how this bill offers some support to the victims. As much of what is in the report will go to some way in assisting those in that category. Presiding officer, when a woman or a child is raped, it's crucial that services are available in an instant. And I know that Rape Crisis is at the sharp end in this regard. And although they can and do deliver vital early assistance, Rape Crisis will signpost victims to medical examinations as soon as possible, as they know how important good, reliable evidence is in the case of rape. Rape Crisis, Scottish Women's Aid and many other third sector organisations who deal with women and children are well aware that the trauma experience with the medical examination is that bit more difficult to deal with if it is carried out by a male doctor, particularly if the crime is of a sexual, violent nature. Presiding officer, I want to make it clear that the last thing that I would want to do is to call the professional capabilities of a male doctor into question. I have the highest regard for the men who work in this very difficult field, but I believe even they, at the start of their work in this area, are reluctant participants, but of course they find it much easier to deal with as they gather experience. On the other hand, for the victims, may they be a woman or a child, a female doctor is less traumatic and just one little bit more reassuring to this important thing that's happening to them and a bit less to worry about. Which as I've already said, is vital for the good, safe forensic evidence purposes, but at the same time is most traumatic for the female or child victim. I would therefore ask and encourage the Scottish Government to look carefully at this matter and give serious consideration on finding ways to provide more female doctors for the service at what is a very vital and most traumatic time for the victims. There is then the issue of victims and relatives attending court only to be confronted by the accuser or, worse still, the abuser when the court sits for sentencing. I know that some of our courts don't easily lend themselves to separation of the accused and the accuser. However, this is one of the biggest negative experiences that victims and their loved ones are likely to complain about. It is a scenario that will have a massive psychological impact on the victim and the family and friends. And for that reason, I would ask the Scottish Government again to look at this sensitive subject very carefully with a view of finding ways that both parties can be kept apart as much as humanly possible. As I am sure that if an accused and accuser were kept apart before the court sat, this would be of great assistance to the victims and offer them protection from any possible further intimidation. Lastly, children are the most difficult to accommodate at trials, in my view. By the very nature of the place, a court is a grown-up establishment and difficult, if not impossible, to soften the edges to accommodate children, let alone have courts entirely suited to children. Courts are seen at best as an unwelcome and at worst somewhat frightening place for vulnerable children. I believe we need to build on the good work already in place to make courts and the system more sympathetic to children. Therefore, those who are fully trained not only in dealing with children and their needs, but trained to navigate for children the pathway of court proceedings is practical benefit for children, and I would be pleased to see that all those who are dealing with children to be trained to the highest level, in particular at interview stage, both before and during a court hearing, making it as normal as possible for a vulnerable child to give good evidence. Giving good evidence is a must, and it must be a top priority for the end result. Not only would this benefit the child and family, but also those engaged at the level at this high level would bring benefit to the court process in both the short and long term, reaching the safest possible conclusion in terms of guilt or innocence. I hope the Government is able to take positive steps on the matters that I have raised to ensure that victims are protected not only in the justice system but in their daily lives. And, Presiding Officer, many thanks for allowing me to make a contribution in this very important matter. Thank you.
Thank you. Now call on Graham Pearson to be followed by Willie Coffey. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Many members in the Chamber will be pleased to know that my voice is on the verge of collapsing, but hopefully I'll maintain for 6 minutes. The Cabinet Secretary introduced this debate this afternoon by indicating that his motion sought to place victims and witnesses at the centre of the criminal justice system. The evidence that the Justice Committee received from victims and witnesses was completely harrowing in identifying that for so many of them, their experience reflected almost a pass-the-parcel attitude in dealing with the problems that they faced and the challenges that they saw in obtaining necessary information. A picture emerged reflecting a justice system focused on solving administrative challenges, but a real question remained about whether victims' and witnesses' needs were being properly answered. There was also a challenge in respect of an absence of monitoring in terms of the standards expected and the services delivered. So questions are pending, and these questions require some answers, and one hopes that the Minister at the end of our debate will be able to give us some comfort in supplying those answers. Does the Government have a confidence that the services, the various services, have the ability to accurately and in a timely fashion update the system in order that witnesses and victims can access that knowledge? Certainly, as far as the police service was concerned and the evidence they gave to committee, the answer was no. They had neither the systems nor the support necessary to properly be aware of the current situation in terms of cases that they dealt with. And I doubt that many others in the system are able to do likewise. From the point of view of a witness or a victim, they face not only the police, but family liaison officers, victim support, victim information service, procurators fiscal, Crown Office advocates, court administrators and lawyers. It's a difficult environment for a member of the public to face. The Cabinet Secretary also indicated that he would be happy to engage with Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service in relation to road traffic deaths and road deaths generally. Families do want information from the authorities in regard to the deaths and serious injuries that their family members suffer. And I hope that the Minister again will be able to give us some comfort in relation to that specific issue. There has been allusion passed in relation to the difficulties that the police might have in supplying victims with an interviewer of a specified gender. As indicated before, I think it is important that where services cannot provide that which is expected of them, a full explanation should be supplied at the time, timeously, in order that transparency is delivered in why those services are not supplied and what alternatives were arranged in the circumstance. Victims may be uncomfortable and distressed by receiving money from offenders, so the victim surcharge payment and compensation orders might not always be appropriate. The Minister should give us some indication whether or not victims and/or witnesses will be consulted in relation to such arrangements. Victim surcharge, in addition, doesn't appear to do much for the victim per se. Indeed, when one looks at the list of services that may be provided in terms of the use of such surcharge payments, it accounts for the cleaning of a crime scene, the providing of very basic requirements by the victim, and some other peripheral issues. But it doesn't deal with the long-term needs of a victim after the process has been completed. Much has been said about the use of the nomenclature victims and complainers. Many in the Chamber won't be surprised that I didn't contribute particularly to this debate. I think it is important that families know that when they have been victimised as a result of a crime or offence, then that status should be acknowledged. Nevertheless, the balance of ensuring proper trial and the balance of justice also needs to be adhered to. Much has been said about Scottish Labour's need for a Victims Commissioner, and I think it's quite appropriate that Jenny Mara should bring up this issue, as it was referred to by individual witnesses who did seek someone to act on their behalf and ensure that services were delivered, and it was discussed at some length within committee. Scottish Labour wants victims and witnesses to receive the services and information that they deserve. We want victims of serious crime to be given the rights to be heard by those involved in the sentencing, bail decision
Should we draw into a close, please?
And parole proceedings for the future. I look forward to hearing from the Minister in that regard and will be supporting the motion at the end of the day.
Many thanks. Now Colin Willie Coffey to be followed by Stuart Maxwell. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thanks very much, Presiding Officer. I'm grateful for the opportunity to contribute to the debate and hope that I can offer a perspective on these issues to complement the obvious hard work carried out by all colleagues serving on the Justice and Health and Sport committees. Getting these proposals right is inevitably going to be a careful balance between the rights of the accused and the rights of victims and witnesses. The committee's final paragraph says as much and anticipates further improvements at stage 2, but the general principles are supported and that is very welcome. If the bill is approved, victims and witnesses will be entitled to more information about their case, standards of service will be consistent and clear, there will be restitution orders made against those convicted of assaulting police officers, and a victim surcharge will be introduced to require offenders to contribute to the cost of supporting their victims. I note the proposal to allow children more freedom to give evidence in court if they wish, and the concern by the committee about that becoming a requirement. But the Cabinet Secretary in his response clarified that this will not be the case and was happy to discuss the matter with the relevant justice partners. I know too there is continuing debate around the issue of the extension of special measures for vulnerable witnesses and the entitlement to contest those in court. And I've listened very carefully to colleagues who have considered the matter in greater depth and will go on to do so at stage 2. Presiding Officer, from my own experience of the justice system, both as a victim and as an elected member supporting victims, I think the proposals will improve the situation for victims in Scotland. And in my view, they offer a little tilt in favour of victims that has been overdue for some time. When the Audit Committee recently looked at the criminal justice system, it was clear from one of the charts illustrating the process that the focus was almost exclusively on the alleged offenders and their journey through the system. There are clear and obvious reasons for that, of course, but not least the requirement to obtain justice for offences committed inevitably means the spotlight falls on the accused and how they are to be taken on that journey. But what wasn't at all clear to me was what the victim's journey looked like or should look like. Often they felt like onlookers staring in through a window while a process was taking place, sometimes without including them at all. These were the feelings of two families in my constituency, one whose daughter was murdered and the other whose daughter died in a tragic accident. Both of the families are clearly victims and they too needed support. And they needed to be at the centre of processes that followed, but they weren't. This led them to feel alienated from a system that they desperately hoped would provide closure for them. They expected to be in the loop at all times and to feel that they too were key parts of the process, rather than feeling like innocent bystanders being carried along in the slipstream. The new bill must address this, I think, and regard victims and witnesses as integral to the justice system. I know from the committee report that there has been a call for standards of service to be set out in the regulations. Now, if the government isn't minded to effect that in the bill, then I hope that it will give consideration at least to setting out guidance, advice on what the victim journey is supposed to look like. From an initial incident, evidence gathering, a trial or fatal accident inquiry and beyond to any further investigations, the victims and their remaining families must be equally served by good communication, access to information, clear indications of timescales and their participation in that, and any further options open to them that they may wish to progress. This sort of level of support should be automatic and not offered only on request. That way, Presiding Officer, I feel that many victims and their families will really begin to feel that the justice system is about them too. My attention was also drawn to the proposal to allow victims to make representations to the parole board when a prisoner becomes eligible for release. As the Cabinet Secretary is aware, one of the families who I am referring to are concerned to ensure that any prisoner eligible for release has a full and detailed risk assessment carried out and that public safety is paramount in making that decision. and I very much hope that the views of victims can be taken into account in this process and perhaps extends this to the families affected by that particular crime too. Presiding Officer, I'm encouraged by the proposals in the bill and the direction of travel we are taking in Scotland to support victims and witnesses. Setting new standards of service, better access to information, better communication and hopefully putting victims at the centre of the justice system will all be a further step in delivering a fairer justice system for all, and at the same time requiring offenders to make reparation to their victims will all be supported, I think, by the people of Scotland. In particular, as we proceed to stage 2, I would remind committee members of the comments by the Royal College of Speech and Language Therapists that people with speech, language and communication difficulties are more likely to be the victims of crime, and to ask colleagues to bear this in mind as we firm up the bill at stage 2. I congratulate the committee so far in its efforts and support the proposal that's in front of us today. Thank you.
Many thanks. Now call on Stuart Maxwell to be followed by John Finney. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I am very grateful for the opportunity to speak today on a subject that goes straight to the central purpose of the justice system, namely the role of victims and witnesses of crime in that system. Before I get into the detail of that, I can't let the moment pass without relating to the issue that's been raised a number of times by members, particularly by Labour members. I'm sorry, but speaking as a member who's been here for over 10 years and a rather experienced, I think, committee convener, I think you risk breaking trust within a committee if you sign up to a recommendation in a report and then come into the chamber and then oppose that very recommendation. I think, frankly, you're risking trust within a committee, and I think that's a mistake. But that's really up to you if that's what you wish to do. Now, moving on, Presiding Officer, ultimately the success of our justice system and our society as a whole can be judged on how we treat the victims of crime. Similarly, witnesses of crime carry out an important civic duty, one that should be recognised and one we must offer them appropriately tailored support, confident that their personal safety will be ensured, in addition to providing them with the adequate level of knowledge to contribute effectively to cases in which they are involved. Now, I believe the Scottish Government's Making Justice Work programme will improve the standards of treatment for victims and witnesses, in addition to improving the criminal justice system as a whole. Constituents have outlined their own experiences of crime to me, as I'm sure they have to other members, and the clear psychological and financial pressures of being a victim of crime are indeed self-evident. The trauma and emotional burden of these events are far-reaching and can often affect entire families and communities. While trying to overcome what can quite often be very traumatic events, victims are also trying to deal with everyday practicalities. Being able to manage your life, your finances and personal relationships effectively can often be difficult under normal circumstances. But when people are given the additional burden of recovering from the emotional scars of a disruptive criminal event in their life, then we must do everything we can to support them. This can also be apparent for witnesses to crime, who should be able to count on the law's full support, as their contribution is essential to an effective justice system. New measures such as the victim surcharge could help to improve the perception from victims that the perpetrators of crime are being held to account for the damage they have caused. When considering the amount that an offender may need to pay, I welcome the structure of priorities that has been put forward, namely the prioritising of the compensation payment, followed by the victim surcharge, then the principal fine. As Victim Support Scotland highlighted in their consultation response, compensation following a crime is often of deeper significance than simply receiving a financial award. Of central importance is the formal acknowledgement and recognition of the suffering of the victim, as well as a validation that what the victim says is true. As such, compensation is an important part in the victim's recovery process. Any requirement for a compensation payment to the victim should ensure that the payment is made as soon as possible. Failure to do so may ultimately lead to the victim to further feelings of victimisation and could also prevent them from having some form of closure. However, I do understand that in some particular cases, receiving money from the offender may be distressing for the victim. And I would welcome further assurances from the Cabinet Secretary that the views and needs of victims will continue to be considered before each individual decision is made on the appropriateness or otherwise of imposing a compensation order. When looking through the consultation, I was encouraged to see the level of engagement in the process, with 59 organisations sending submissions to the Scottish Government. There were a number of consistent themes that emerged from these submissions, and there are 2 points in particular I would like to highlight. Firstly, the consultation responses repeatedly highlighted the need for victims and witnesses to have access to information that is consistent, clear and accessible. The creation of an online information hub will assist in the development of this principle and, if implemented effectively, will greatly assist in improving accessibility. Now, I note the Justice Committee's concerns that the online information hub should not be a replacement for human interaction and support for victims. I therefore welcome the Cabinet Secretary's clarification that any new online information hub would act only as a supplement rather than as a replacement to the vital face-to-face support that victims so obviously need and already receive. The ability of victims to access more general practical information about the justice system is also a welcome measure. Previous constituency cases in which I have been involved have shown that constituents would welcome measures that give them a better understanding of procedures which have the potential to have a significant impact on their lives. It is also my understanding that constituents would feel a greater sense of engagement with the criminal justice system more generally if they were given more case-specific information relevant to their circumstances. Indeed, any additional support or information that isn't already provided could alleviate frustrations that victims often feel from having no previous knowledge or experience of the system. As an extension to the proposal of an online information hub, consultation responses also consistently call for victims and witnesses to have access to information which gives them an accurate appraisal of their active role within the system. A greater understanding for participants will lead to an overall more engaging experience and ensure that their expectations are managed more effectively. Victims and witnesses should neither be made to feel that their role has been downplayed to a point where they feel undervalued or detached from the process, nor should it be overinflated and their expectations of an active role cannot realistically be met. In particular, clarity has been sought over the definition of participate effectively when referring to a victim or witness's active participation. A number of organisations have expressed confusion in their consultation responses as to what exactly this term implied, and other members, including the convener of the committee, raised it earlier. I therefore hope that the Cabinet Secretary is able to offer additional clarity to the concerns raised by the Justice Committee on this specific point. The Victims and Witnesses Bill is relatively broad in its scope, and there are a number of other points I would like to see examined in further detail. The extension of the victim notification scheme, the establishment of a national confidential forum, and the improving of support for vulnerable witnesses are all worthy of further debate. But I am pleased to note the Justice Committee's support for the general principles, and I am delighted that the Scottish Government have continued to commit to improving the experiences of people within the justice system.
Many thanks. I now call on John Finney to be followed by Roderick Campbell. 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. How we deal with victims and witnesses marks us out as the sort of society we are, and I certainly want us to be a society that cares and is compassionate about victims and witnesses. In my background as a police officer, I know only too well that police officers, procurators fiscal and indeed court officials routinely deal with witnesses and victims. However, we would all forget at our peril that it's a unique experience for many of those, their first-time engagement with these services. And of course, there are indeed particular challenges associated with repeat victims. I think there's huge progress being made, certainly since my time, with both the police and the Crown with regard to issues like domestic abuse and sexual crimes. There's a way to go on that, and I think this legislation will play its part, not without some challenges. There's been much discussion in the debate about giving witnesses and victims the right to certain information, and the Justice Committee did indeed support that and the online hub. And like others, I'm grateful for the response from the Cabinet Secretary to the Stage 1, which suggested that it wasn't intended as a replacement for human contact. I think there's no substitute for an empathetic human, and lest we all forget also there is the needs of those who are not online who need to be serviced. Clear standards of service is a phrase that's mentioned, and one of the often unintended offences that caused to victims is the manner in which information is, or frequently, more commonly indeed, isn't relayed, and this relates to issues like changes of pleas, charges dropped, release on bail. The Children's Commissioner gave the committee an excellent document, the Children's Rights Impact Assessment, in which he refers to the standards of service and the fact that there's no mention of them being monitored, evaluated or reported. And I note the Cabinet Secretary in his response said there would be individual standards, and I'm sure that's something we would want to look further into. I don't see any intrusion into the rights of the accused. I think a presumption of innocence must apply, that this legislation certainly passes human rights test and is not in conflict in the bill at all. Clearly, there's degrees of vulnerability, and no one welcomes standing in a court, often required to point out the accused, and most will feel vulnerable. The presumption that certain categories are more vulnerable and given right to utilise special measures is important, and it is welcomed by me, as is the victim's assessment. But of course, there's no point in assessing need unless you meet the need. And one way that will go towards meeting that need is the assurance from the Scottish Court Services just within the last couple of weeks of a commitment to making facilities available across the country, and that is to be welcomed. The Justice Committee did ask the Scottish Government to make every effort, and I quote, to ensure the removal of the presumption that child witnesses under 12 will give evidence away from court building does not lead to the unintended consequence of children giving evidence in court against their will. And again, I think this illustrates where differing views are taken, and the reassurance from the Cabinet Secretary that the bill makes a small amendment to put more weight on the views of the child, so that if the child expresses a desire to give evidence in court, and some do along with their parents, there will be a presumption this will be allowed. The Victims' Organisations Collaboration Forum correspondence has been alluded to by some, my colleague Alison McInnes, so I won't go into detail there other than to reiterate that is a genuine concern they have about the appeal and the removal from the bill. And note, again, in the response to the Stage 1 report, the Cabinet Secretary advises as he's discussing this with the Crown Office Procurator Fiscal Service. And I certainly think it's an important issue and hope there's a positive response to that, these specific concerns of the victims group. Committee members have alluded to the harrowing testimony we heard from victims firsthand and the traumatic effects that not just affect them but their families, their friends and indeed entire communities with long-lasting effects, and the health and well-being implications for them. No one wants to be a victim or indeed a witness, and I'm delighted that a near 40-year reduction in low level of crime means there will be less victims. Of course, there is no room for complacency with that matter. We've also heard from on the issue of complainer versus victim, and I would lend a lot of support and would encourage others to the position taken by the Children's Commissioner in relation to this, and that is that child victims must be believed, and they're believed by given that tag. I think perhaps in the committee we became more hooked up on that than the general public would be. I've written to the Cabinet Secretary in recent days, along with the Health Secretary, asking for a lead role to be played by Victims of Sport Scotland in taking this legislation forward. It's important they're there from the very start. Police liaison officers have a very specific case-related role to discharge, and it's not a criticism of that role to say it's not the hand-on practical role that VSS can and should provide more of. They do, as people know, administer the Victims Fund, and that can be from the harrowing issues of a replacement bed for a rape victim to glasses for an older person that's the victim of a robbery. That's a very important early contact. And I would put that in line with the preventative spend that the Scottish Government is following, because if we can get these issues right, then the cost of individual and family health, of employment, can be dealt with, and that will come with adequate support. There's a range of other issues that I don't have time to touch on. I think it is fair to say that there are challenges connected with the IT system and the support that would fall to victims from that. Graham Pearson's comments are quite right there. Gender-specific interviewer and examiner, there are particular challenges with that, not least for rural areas. On the principle of the bill, I'm very supportive of it. We look forward to scrutinising it at stage 2. Thank you very much.
And thank you very much. And I now call on Roderick Campbell, after which we'll move to the closing speeches. 6 minutes, please, Mr Campbell, or thereby.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I welcome the opportunity to speak in this debate, and I refer to my register of interest as a member of the Faculty of Advocates. I believe the bill is a very welcome step forward and comprises a package of measures designed to ensure that those who find themselves caught up in the criminal justice system in particular obtain effective and efficient assistance from the organisations they have to deal with during the criminal procedure through to trial, sentencing and after proceedings have come to an end. We've come a long way in terms of extending the rights of victims and witnesses since devolution began, with a victims strategy first published 12 years ago and the national standards for victims of crime set in 2005. Since then, the victim notification scheme has been extended. Victim statements were introduced in solemn cases from 2009. Even as we have heard, many witnesses don't believe that their statements have been accorded as much importance in the process as they would like. And we heard also from Graham Pearson earlier in the debate that many witnesses feel quite detached from the process. Nevertheless, I think we have made progress. We have still a long way to go, as Victims Support Scotland and others have said. In the short time available, I would just like to highlight a few points. With regard to reviewing a decision not to prosecute, Section 3 of the bill provides that victims will be able to request information about a decision not to proceed with a criminal investigation and any reasons for that decision. This is, of course, in line with the EU Directive on Victims and offers victims an additional safety net. I have to say I was initially concerned with the idea that victims would be able to challenge the Crown's decision not to prosecute. However, I believe the purpose of this provision is simply to request a review. The purpose of the provision, in my view, is to introduce a greater degree of transparency and accountability. I await with interest the Crown Office research on review, which is yet to be disclosed. With regard to victim notification generally, the effects on a victim of releasing someone from prison without providing reasonable notice and giving them time to prepare physically and mentally for the return to the community, for example, has the potential to be extremely traumatic. But specifically in relation to life prisoners who have passed the punishment part of their sentence, and where the sole consideration is protection of the public, and whether the offender represents a danger to the public, it's right as the committee recognise that false expectations should not be raised. While recognising the right of victims to make oral representations to the parole board, it's also right, in my view, that consideration is given to allow legal representation for offenders. It must be a balanced process. The committee recognised that further guidance needed to be developed on this matter, and I'm pleased that the Cabinet Secretary and his officials will continue to engage with the parole board to ensure that appropriate measures are put in place through revised guidance in order, hopefully, that victims understand the process more fully. I believe also that the revised guidance should allow for the offender to see the victim's views in most cases when they meet with the parole board, again in keeping with transparency. I also welcome the Cabinet Secretary's assurance that victims who are currently registered on the Victim Notification Scheme will be kept informed of changes to the nature of that information, the nature of the information that they're entitled to. In relation to restitution orders, I note the Scottish Government's position, and I have to accept that the focus in relation to those orders should be on the police, but I notice the flexibility on that issue. Moving on to the more controversial area of the extent to which there should be a right of objection to the grant of special measures. While I accept the argument that it seems illogical to extend the categories of vulnerable witnesses for whom access to special measures is automatic, while at the same time bringing in provisions enabling objections to be raised, nevertheless I instinctively side with the lobby that suggests a right of objection needs to be preserved under ECHR. I heard what Malcolm Chisholm said earlier. I wasn't quite sure whether he was misunderstanding what the Children's Commissioner has said. He referred to the fact there was no reference to this in the EU directive, but I'd be happy to stand corrected if that's his position. And as Murdo MacLeod of the Faculty of Advocates also pointed out, under Section 271D of the 1995 Criminal Procedure Act, which is not being reviewed by this legislation, a judge can review special measures at any time, even during the trial itself, although it's unlikely he will do so, save in exceptional circumstances. But I think we need to have faith in judges. I don't see a perfect solution to this problem, and I note that the government is consulting further. I hope that there will be some flexibility preserved, however, while recognising the real concerns here that objections should not be routinely allowed for automatic special measures for children. With regard to families of road death victims, while I recognise that we've heard evidence from witnesses to the effect that they have encountered difficulties in obtaining information from the Crown, I believe that an unfettered statutory right to information would, in my view, cause distress on occasion, certainly given the contents of some photographs of crash scenes. I would therefore welcome a Crown Code of Practice rather than statutory rights. Finally, I want to mention the issue of separate representation for victims in dealing with sexual history applications, for example. I think we ought to recognise that the Crown's interest may not be identical to that of the victim. I think it's right that this issue is to be explored further, and I welcome the Government's commitment to engage with the Faculty of Advocates and Rape Crisis Scotland on this issue. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Many thanks. And we now move to the closing speeches, and I call on Annette Milne. Up to 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. With a voice a little bit like Graham Pearson's, I must apologise for my late arrival in the Chamber this afternoon, the reasons for which I've explained in writing. I am pleased to be speaking at stage 1 of the Victims and Witnesses Scotland Bill. Praise is certainly due to the Government for bringing before Parliament a bill dedicated to the rights of victims and witnesses. This reflects the growing consensus that victims are not given sufficient thought in the criminal justice system. Of course, what a victim wants more than anything else is not to be a victim at all. But if a crime is committed, the justice system must at all stages deliver for them, and it has become clear that this isn't always the case. The victim must not become some side thought, a prosecution witness or a name on a police file who drops off the radar screen unless and until a trial commences. The bill goes some way to redress this imbalance in our criminal justice system, which too often places the rights of the accused above the rights of victims, but there is room for improvement, as others have said. The bill significantly extends the entitlement to special measures available to victims and will automatically grant them to witnesses under the age of 18, to victims of sexual offences, of domestic abuse, human trafficking and stalking, and will allow any witness to be considered vulnerable following assessment. Murdo MacLeod, QC, told the Justice Committee he expected around 18,000 additional witnesses will be deemed vulnerable under the proposals, meaning giving evidence will be made easier for a significant number of victims of crime. The bill places a duty on courts to consider a compensation order in relevant cases, including where a person has been caused personal injury, loss, damage, alarm or distress as a result of an offender's actions. Clearly, some victims do not want anything to do with an offender, but many would see justice if those who've caused them harm or loss are forced to compensate directly. I hope the bill will increase the use of compensation orders, but more must be done to ensure the court service is more effective at collecting fines. The bill also establishes a victim surcharge, which will require offenders to pay into a victims fund, which will be used to provide practical assistance to victims with immediate unmet needs. This will go some way to helping victims in the aftermath of a crime. Again, this policy in itself is welcome, but it is hardly ambitious because the victim surcharge, I understand, will only, at least initially, apply to those given court fines. This would mean an offender found guilty of a road traffic offence would contribute to the fund, while a violent offender would not. This, to me, seems far from ideal. However, Presiding Officer, as a member of the Health and Sport Committee, the only part of the bill which I have studied in detail, some of which I'll now consider, is that which concerns the establishment of a national confidential forum, which was generally welcomed by those who gave evidence to the committee, although there were some caveats. For example, Aberlour and Children First, whilst welcoming proposals to create a safe, confidential space in which people can talk about their experiences, pointed out that while some survivors of childhood abuse may find this a cathartic experience which helps them to move on, others may find it re-traumatising, or that it raises thoughts and feelings which they need to explore out with the forum. Some witnesses felt that acknowledgement alone was not enough, and that without remedies, this could impact negatively on the health and well-being of some survivors. There was consensus, as recognised by the Scottish Government, that access to counselling, therapeutic support, mental health services and advocacy will be essential if survivors are to gain benefit in their health and well-being from participation in the forum. And it was agreed that appropriate services must be available for all who take part in the forum, whether they're older people, young adults, those with disabilities, with mental health issues, or those living outside Scotland, or whatever their life circumstances. A person-centred approach was held to be crucial, with a choice of support available, and available for up to 2 years, and also a one-stop approach to counselling and advocacy. So strong was the stated need for support that the committee wishes the Scottish Government to ensure the availability of services for participants in the forum, to support them before, during and after taking part, as Duncan McNeill said in his speech, and more widely for all adult survivors who may require psychological or counselling support. The NCF must have operational autonomy if it is to perform its role effectively and with credibility, and some concerns were expressed about the proposal to position it within the Mental Welfare Commission, fearing that the stigma associated with mental health might transmit to adult survivors of childhood abuse. However, the committee was reassured that it would be clear to those survivors coming forward to participate in the forum that they would be taking part in the NCF as a separate entity from the Mental Welfare Commission, whilst it would benefit from the infrastructure, the governance and expertise of the Commission. A number of witnesses felt that there's a need to broaden the range of those entitled to participate in the forum, to include people who had experienced abuse within particularly foster care, but also kinship care, with children and Aberlour actually wanting natural families included as well. And there were suggestions that the qualifying age should be lowered. A number of other issues were raised with the committee, which no doubt will be aired at stage 2, but suffice to say that expectations for the NCF are high. The Health and Sport Committee welcomes what's envisaged, but sees the need for more detail to be provided on how it will work in practice. To conclude, Presiding Officer, while this bill is largely to be welcomed, it can undoubtedly be improved and built upon. It will help to put the rights of victims and witnesses nearer to the forefront of the minds of the police, the Crown and the court service. It is just a shame, as my colleague said, that victims and witnesses were ignored by the Scottish Government when it took the decision to close a fifth of Scotland's sheriff courts. And that adds to the ongoing slap in the face for victims of crime that is the continuation of automatic early release of prisoners. But that is another debate, and I'll leave it for another time. So, as John Lamont has said, Presiding Officer, my party will be supporting the bill at stage 1. Thank you.
Thanks. And we now call on Jenny Mara. Up to 8 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. One of the most important opportunities this bill has given us is the chance to listen and learn from the experiences of those who have suffered, often irreconcilably, the damage caused by crimes committed against them and their loved ones. In that vein, I want to turn to the provisions within the bill to create a national confidential forum for the survivors of historic abuse. Since 2004, successive governments have sought to account for the abuse suffered by children in residential care in Scotland. This forum represents the latest development in that journey, as articulated by my colleague Duncan McNeill, stemming from the Time to be Heard pilot that listened to the stories of 98 survivors of the abuse from the Quarriers residential care home alone. We recognise and fully support the need for survivors to be heard in a confidential manner. For many, the suffering that is eased by an acknowledgement of their abuse is hugely beneficial. In a response to a parliamentary question recently from my colleague Neil Bibby, MSP, that in April, the Minister stated that a consultation had just closed on the time bar issue for historical abuse and that responses were currently being analysed. She also said that this bill, the Victims and Witnesses Bill, was currently going through Parliament and suggested to the member that he should keep tabs on that bill in relation to the time bar issue. Therefore, I would like to ask the Minister if she could perhaps address in her summing up what progress has been made in analysing those consultation responses and, as her answer to Neil Bibby alluded, whether we would have the opportunity to consider any alteration to the time bar in the passage of this bill. I understand that so far we have not seen any proposals from the Government in this bill, but I would be interested to know if the Government was intending to bring forward changes to the time bar at stage 2 or stage 3, as she alluded to my colleague Neil Bibby. Presiding Officer, we would like to see additional protections in this bill for families affected by fatal road accidents, and we heard evidence in committee to this end. We heard evidence from the SKID campaign, who are campaigning for a statutory right to access investigation materials on request. And I believe that the on request element of this statutory right is a very important part of this proposal, because I have listened very carefully to Colin Keir's personal account of this, and I'm convinced that being given these documents when you don't want them can be extremely harrowing and indeed shouldn't happen. However, access to these documents on request for many families will give them the information they need to understand what happened to their loved ones and to help their grieving, certainly.
Colin Keir.
I thank the member for taking the intervention. Would the member agree that people in the position of grieving relatives find themselves in would not necessarily understand what they are actually seeking? And although they are asking for all information, there are some absolutely harrowing road traffic accidents there that, quite frankly, could do more harm than good by handing out.
Jenny Mara.
Presiding officer, I take the member's point, and I don't believe this is an easy issue, and that is why I've come to the conclusion that the campaign on request is a better way to phrase this statutory right. But there are many families who have come before the committee and have not been given access to these documents that they really feel they want, because many of them don't even know what happened to their loved ones and the circumstances under which they lost their lives. And I think we need improvements on this, and there are many families who would like that statutory right in the law. So I hope the government might consider bringing an amendment itself to stage 2 with a right to information on request. And I note today that there is already support for this proposal on their own backbenches, as Mr Allard articulated earlier. If I can turn to the issue of human trafficking, presiding officer, I would like to ask the Minister in closing about specific suggestions that have come to us through CARE, an organisation that works with victims of human trafficking. And I know that the other members, Sandra White mentioned human trafficking earlier and is concerned that perhaps there is better care for victims of human trafficking in this bill. CARE's proposals stem from provisions within the European Union Anti-Trafficking Directive, which came into force in Scotland on the 6th of April this year. That directive requires 3 steps to be taken to protect victims of human trafficking that are not included in this bill. Firstly, to avoid unnecessary repetition of interviews during investigation, prosecution or trial. Secondly, to avoid visual contact between victims and defendants while giving evidence in interviews or cross-examination. And thirdly, to avoid unnecessary questioning of the victim's private life, something I touched on more widely for sexual offences in my opening remarks. The directive also outlines a range of measures in Article 15(3) to specifically protect child victims. Given the date for implementing the directive has now passed, it was the 6th of April, I would like to know whether the Government intend on using this bill as an opportunity to put these protections in place, as victims of human trafficking are particularly vulnerable. And I understand from correspondence that the Cabinet Secretary and I have had that the Scottish Government believe that they are compliant with that directive that came into force on the 6th of April. So perhaps the Minister can tell us in her closing remarks if the Scottish Government believe that these protections which I've just outlined for victims of human trafficking actually exist in other pieces of legislation and aren't necessary to go in this bill. Presiding officer, while we back the principles of this bill, it's clear that there are many improvements that could be made. Labour's proposals for case companions and a victims commissioner would improve how we interact with victims and witnesses, as well as how we keep the system under constant review. We have made suggestions in areas such as fatal road accidents, cases involving sexual offences and human trafficking cases, and we would like to hear the Government's proposals for any alteration on the time bar on cases of historic sexual abuse, as the Minister indicated to my colleague previously. All of these suggestions, I think, warrant further consideration, and I hope to see progress on them as this bill proceeds to stage 2 and beyond. But Scottish Labour will be supporting the general principles of this bill today.
Many thanks. And I now call on Rosanna Cunningham to wind up the debate. Minister, you have until 5:28.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I start by thanking members in the Chamber for their many and even occasionally constructive contributions, and particularly those members who sat on both the Justice and Health and Sport committees for all their work over the last few months. Christine Graham, I think, also reminded us rightly of all of those individuals who gave evidence to one or other of those committees, and I think Duncan Makepeal talked in those terms as well. And we do owe them thanks for taking the time to do that, even when it may have been a very difficult thing for them to do. There have been a huge number of issues raised. It is frankly impossible for me to deal with every single point in the time available. What I hope to do is deal with some of the main issues that have arisen throughout today's debate. Members across the Chamber clearly share a desire to create a justice system which offers more support to victims and witnesses than has been the case in the past. If we're honest, for too long, victims were treated as nothing more than bystanders in proceedings. Now, Jenny Mara mentioned a very particularly distressing case in her opening speech, which directly affected a constituent of mine with whom I have been working closely for a number of years. Many issues were raised by the experience of the family concerned, and I can say that they were very pleased to meet with the Cabinet Secretary this morning to discuss the bill, which they do see as a big improvement. The bill may not answer every single question raised today or by others, but it is a significant step towards putting victims and witnesses at the heart of the justice system and will give them more of a voice. For example, the bill will enable victims to make oral representations to the parole board when life sentence prisoners are being considered for release on licence, if they feel more comfortable making their concerns known in this way. The bill also addresses one of the biggest issues raised by victims and witnesses, a lack of information about their case. And I know that practically every member in this constituency will have had, in this chamber, will have had experience of people who felt that they simply didn't have enough information about the case that may involve them. The bill will give such individuals a right to certain information from organisations across the justice system. This will ensure that vital information is available to those who need it when they need it. And can I say, I do hear the request made by Christine Graham that any information be supplied in plain English. And I think that we would all echo that desire. Out with the bill, we've committed to working with our justice partners to examine the feasibility of setting up an online information sharing hub to make accessing that information easier. And it is important for everybody to recognise that this bill is not the only work that is being done in respect of victims and witnesses. The creation of the victim surcharge will ensure that offenders contribute directly to a fund to assist victims of crime. The fund will provide prompt and practical support to victims when they need it most in the immediate aftermath of the crime itself. There may be reservations about this, and I understand those reservations, but Stuart Maxwell is right to commend its introduction, and of course it will be considered sensitively. A number of members, including John Lamont, raised the issue of a definition for the word victim. Now, Presiding Officer, I confess I'm baffled by this sudden apparent confusion over this definition. Neither as an MP or an MSP or in my previous profession as a lawyer have I ever had any doubt about who a victim was or what a victim was. I'm curious as to quite how this concern has arisen. It doesn't, in our view, in the government's view, seem to be a particularly well-founded concern, given that the word victim is so much in the use of the public and is well understood as it is throughout the justice system. Sandra White requested that the government will give further consideration to the specific issue of traffic victims, as did Jenny Mara, and I can confirm that the government will be happy to do so. Colin Keir and Gil Patterson both raised the question of same-gender support, particularly in sensitive criminal proceedings. The Cabinet Secretary, they will be pleased to know, can I just finish this point, is currently in discussion with Rape Crisis Scotland regarding medical examiners and is looking at the wider issue. And the Government will discuss this further with the police and, crucially, NHS before stage 2.
Jenny Mara.
Thank the Minister for giving way. The Minister said she'd be happy to look, to look at protection for victims of human trafficking. Will she be able to confirm that the 3 measures that were specified by the EU directive are either already in Scots law or the Government would consider in amendments in this bill at stage 2?
I think Jenny Mara probably does know that these matters are currently under review and that the Government is working directly with the police on them. Alison McInnes has asked about anonymity orders. I know each member asked about a number of different things, but I'm trying to collect in some of the key things. There has been discussion with the police and SCDA, but so far there doesn't seem to be compelling evidence to support the introduction of investigative anonymity orders, which would be in addition to the protections currently in place, such as witness anonymity orders. But these discussions are ongoing. If I could turn more specifically to witnesses, being a witness is a vitally important civic duty, and giving evidence in court can be an unfamiliar and uncomfortable experience. Often that fact is forgotten by those professionals within the system. Vulnerable witnesses often need extra help to give their best evidence. Well, the bill makes a number of further changes to improve the way in which vulnerable witnesses are identified and supported to give their best evidence. And these changes include raising the age of a child witness from 16 to 18 and introducing a presumption that alleged victims of certain crimes are vulnerable and should be able to access special measures. So the bill will also ensure that every witness is given an individual assessment to determine their potential vulnerability, so as to ensure that the appropriate support can be put in place. I was interested in a general theme of both Christine Graham and Rod Campbell's contributions, raising, as they did, an overarching concern about the management of expectations of both victims and witnesses, and the need to ensure that people are not led to believe that they will get more than is realistically possible. I know that this will be kept in mind. If I could turn now to the issues raised around the question of duties on the criminal justice system. This bill creates a duty on criminal justice agencies to set out clear standards of service for victims and witnesses and an effective route for complaints. This will ensure that victims and witnesses know how they can expect to be treated when dealing with each justice agency and how to complain if standards are not met. A number of members, including Malcolm Chisholm, raised the issue of a victim commissioner, and there has been some heated debate around this, but proponents do have to respond, I think, to both Victim Support Scotland and Scottish Women's Aid in their opposition to this proposal. Malcolm Chisholm also raised, along with Graham Pearson and Willie Coffey, concerns about how the standard of service is to be monitored and other questions allied to that. I can reassure those members that victim support organisations will be consulted in setting standards, and the government is willing to look at the establishment of a formal monitoring process. So these things are still under consideration. Christian Allard concentrated on access to information about fatal road accidents, and I think it would be useful for the Chamber just to take a moment to commend the Decker family and Skid for their tireless work on the issue of road deaths over many years in this Parliament. Turning now to the establishment of the National Confidential Forum, this is a critical part of our Survivor Scotland strategy, which aims to improve the health and well-being of all survivors of childhood abuse. The forum will be unique in offering people placed in institutional care as children acknowledgement and belief without judgment or interrogation. And it will also be uniquely placed to reflect the experiences it hears in recommendations to policymakers and service providers to help ensure that the mistakes of the past are not repeated. I do believe that it is important and timely that people who grew up in children's homes and other institutions are given a voice. This is particularly so for survivors of historic institutional abuse who may never have had the opportunity to share their experiences. The focus of the National Confidential Forum on Institutional Care is based on evidence of what works. We know that the model of confidential acknowledgement to be offered by the Forum works for people placed in institutions as children, and will be particularly important for people placed in care at a time when there were no national standards, no inspection regimes and few routes for children to raise complaints. It is clear that the Forum is not the whole response. I think many of Duncan McNeill's comments are directed towards that reality. Can I reassure him that the Government is considering how we might take cognizance of the issue of those who were abused while in foster care? They have not been forgotten. The Centre for Excellence for Looked After Children and In-Care Survivors Support Scotland are currently undertaking work funded by the Scottish Government to look at how acknowledgement as a model could work in the context of foster care. Now, I accept that there are some stakeholders who think that this has not gone far enough, this bill. However, I believe that the Forum must have a clear and distinct role and scope, which will enable it to complement but not duplicate the range of other responses in place for survivors of childhood abuse. In conclusion, I have been heartened by the general support for the bill and for the wider aim of improving support for victims and witnesses. The Government is not complacent. We recognise that there is a need to give further consideration to some of the issues discussed here today, and we will work with colleagues throughout the process so we can ensure that victims' rights are embedded in our justice system. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And that concludes the debate on stage 1 of the Victims and Witnesses Scotland Bill, and it's now time to move on to the next item of business, which is consideration of motion number 7008 in the name of Dave Thompson on minor standing order rule changes. So I now call on Dave Thompson to move and speak to the motion on behalf of the Standards Procedure and Public Appointments Committee. Mr Thompson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm sure members have been waiting all afternoon for this debate. Yes, I am. I'm really pleased to hear that, and I'm going to be speaking for at least half an hour now. The Standards Procedures and Public Appointments Committee is recommending minor changes to standing orders. The first change removes references to the Public Standards Commissioner, the Public Appointments Commissioner and the Commission for Ethical Standards in Public Life in Scotland. Standing orders have been updated to reflect the creation of a new Commissioner for Ethical Standards in Public Life in Scotland. So you'll notice the difference there between the Commission for Ethical Standards and the Commissioner for Ethical Standards. The second change is a technical one, which deletes a reference in standing orders which gives effect to a rule in the Scottish Parliamentary Pension Scheme. This rule has been repealed, so the standing order reference is no longer required. The motion in my name invites Parliament to note the Committee's 5th report of 2013 and agree these standing order changes, with effect from the 1st of July 2013. I hereby move the motion in my name.
Many thanks. And the question on this motion will be put at decision time. And the next item of business is consideration of business motion 7043 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau setting out a business programme. And I'd ask any member who wishes to speak against the motion to press the request to speak button now. I now call on Joe Fitzpatrick to move motion number 7043. Minister.
Moved.
Thank you. And as no member has asked to speak against the motion, therefore I'll now put the question to the Chamber. And the question is that motion number 7043 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are. The next item of business is consideration of 3 Parliamentary Bureau motions, and I'd ask Joe Fitzpatrick to move motion number 7046 on designation of a lead committee and motion numbers 7045 and 7047 on approved SSIs. Minister.
Moved on block.
Thank you. And the questions on these motions will be put at decision time, to which we now come. And there are 5 questions to be put as a result of today's business. And the first question is that motion number 6987 in the name of Kenny McCaskill on Victims and Witnesses Scotland Bill be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are. The motion is therefore agreed to. This next question is that motion number 7008 in the name of Dave Thompson on minor standing order rule changes be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are. The motion is therefore agreed to. The third question is that motion number 7046 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on designation of a lead committee be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The motion is therefore agreed to. The fourth question is that motion 7045 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on approval of an SSSI be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The motion is therefore agreed to. The final question is that motion 7047 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on approval of an SSI be agreed to. Are we all agreed? That motion is therefore agreed to too, and that concludes decision time. Thank you. We'll now move on to members' business. I'd ask members who are leaving the chamber to do so quickly and quietly.